Join me as I go
back in time.
All the way back to the mid-90s, when they conceived of and began to write Futurama. That's right, we're going to cover the golden era of Futurama, the Fox seasons, the Robo-Creme de la Robo-Creme, the standard definition tearjerkers, the funny but also thinky sci-fi fun-stravaganza. Futurama's first 72 episodes on Fox gets its own retrospective, starting... Obviously, it's impossible to talk about Futurama without first talking about the adult animation juggernaut The Simpsons, both created by cartoonist Matt Groening. After The Simpsons' instantaneous and monumental success, Fox wanted another one, and why wouldn't they? So around 1996, Groening enlisted Simpsons writer and sci-fi fanatic David X. Cohen to help develop a new comedic science fiction series for Fox. What came out of that was Futurama, after a long and painful development and pitching process, but eventually Fox picked up the series for a 13-episode inaugural season. When I say that Futurama had a tumultuous history, that would be a major understatement. From the get-go, Fox had concerns over the premise and wanted more creative control than they had over The Simpsons, a notion that Groening outright rejected. Groening seemed very confident in their vision for the show.
So with The Simpsons, that was my take on the American family. So what I've done to the American family with The Simpsons, we're going to do to science fiction with Futurama.
In spite of the struggles to get the show up and running, they managed to put together an incredible writer's room and voice cast. The writer's room consisted of many Simpsons alum as well as newcomers, but most notable was the sheer amount of cumulative education the staff had. There were 3 PhDs and 7 master's degrees in the writing staff alone, which shined through in a lot of its science-focused humor.
And the winner is number 3 in a quantum finish.
No fair! You change the outcome by measuring it.
But the cast was really something special, gathering some of the most talented voice performers in the business. Billy West played an avalanche of characters, including Fry, Zoidberg, and the Professor. Katie Sagal was perfect as Taranga Leela. John DiMaggio literally stole the show as Bender. And then rounding out the cast were Phil Lamar, Lauren Tom, Maurice LaMarche, and Tress MacNeille. Truly one of the most legendary voice casts that has ever existed. And that cast almost included the incomparable Phil Hartman, who sadly passed before he could fill the role of Zapp Brannigan. So with such a top-notch writing staff and voice cast, why did the show have so much trouble with the network and with audiences? Well, there are a few reasons for this. Futurama was basically The Simpsons' younger sibling, and being the follow-up to arguably the most popular show of all time is a lot to live up to. The audience already goes in with a certain type of expectation, and I think for a lot of people, these expectations weren't immediately met, or the true nature of the show wasn't immediately understood. But Fox didn't really help in this matter either. They opted to shuffle Futurama's scheduled airtime multiple times over its run on the network. The show was persistently pulled from the schedule due to sporting events that ran long, and their erratic release ultimately led to the 4 produced seasons of Futurama being spread out over 5 broadcast seasons instead. But in spite of these obstacles, Futurama managed to accumulate a very dedicated audience over its time on Fox, though its saving grace would ultimately be Adult Swim, who started syndicating the series alongside Family Guy. This consistent time slot grew the show's audience exponentially and in the end saved the series. But let's back it up again and talk about the actual content of seasons 1 through 4, because that's really what I'm here to do. The production and history of the show is totally fascinating stuff, but the thing we're all interested in is the show itself. So I'm going to talk about the show in the format and order that it was intended to be watched in. Though the show ended up shuffling the order and releasing 5 broadcast seasons, which you might be familiar with if you watch the show on Hulu, I'm going to be talking about each of the first 4 production seasons as they were produced. So let's start with where it all began, December 31st, 1999. Or actually, March 28th, 1999. That's when the episode aired. Space Pilot 3000 will go down in history as one of the greatest pilots of all time. The episode so expertly sets up our main characters, the premise of the series, and the setting with an efficiency rarely seen in TV. Just from the cold open alone, we're introduced to Philip J. Fry, understand his place in the world, see the inciting incident for the entire series, and are introduced to the overall premise. It's so incredibly well written.
Parents. Co-workers, my girlfriend. I'll never see any of them again. Yahoo!
This pilot should be studied ad nauseum by up-and-coming writers, but even after the cold open, the episode introduces us to both Taranga Leela and Bender Bending Rodriguez, establishing their own fears and insecurities naturally and effectively.
You Chip. What are you doing?
Quitting.
Why?
Because I've always wanted to.
Wait, you're the only friend I have.
You really want a robot for a friend?
One of my favorite shots in the entire series is this introductory shot of New York as Fry ventures out into his new surroundings for the first time. It so perfectly establishes this weird retro future that Futurama would become known for. Hover cars, weird billboards, giant pneumatic tubes. All of these things add to the charm of the world that they were building. It never feels like an unrecognizable world of future tech. It's all vaguely familiar with a futuristic twist. And this was intentional. The point was that though this series took place in the future, they needed the audience to still find it relatable. It was taking modern problems and reflecting them through a futuristic mirror. So like I said, this pilot is one of the all-time greats, beautifully establishing characters, setting, and premise in a hilarious and efficient package. And also a glimpse of the heart the show would become known for.
My parents abandoned me here as a baby, and I don't even know what galaxy they were from. I know how it feels to be alone.
And the continued introduction of the world of tomorrow was paced perfectly. The second episode the series has landed introduces us to our secondary characters, Amy, Hermes, and Zoidberg, and also brings the crew off-world for the very first time, albeit not very far, just the moon, but the slow reveal of how big the Futurama universe could be was welcomed, because there was simply so much to establish in the expansive landscape of the series. And while the second episode is absolutely hilarious, it reaffirms that the show is going to have an emotional core that tugged at the heartstrings. This episode was so smart because it tried to show us this new and exciting future through Fry's eyes.
The moon was like this awesome, romantic, mysterious thing, hanging up there in the sky where you could never reach it, no matter how much you wanted to.
God, I just really love that scene. And the first season is immaculately paced. The third episode, I Roommate, firmly establishes Fry's friendship with Bender, as well as gives him a place to live, something that we needed to know as he was thrust into the future. Love's Labor's Lost in Space introduces Zap Brannigan and establishes a lot of Leela's long-standing character traits and long-standing regrets. It also brings in Nibbler, who would play a big role later. They just did a great job introducing us to what the show had to offer without wasting any real time, and slowly began to move the crew further and further away from Earth, landing on alien worlds in Love's Labor's Lost in Space, Fear of a Bot Planet, and My Three Sons. But they also weren't afraid to do hilarious, grounded stories simply set in New York. A Fishful of Dollars shows Fry become a billionaire thanks to the interest in his bank account over 1,000 years, and though they obviously needed to re-establish the status quo and make him lose all of his money, it was a really funny and interesting character study. Plus, it introduced us to the longtime antagonist of the series, Mom. They also made an effort, even this early on, to have pro-environmental messages in the show. A Big Piece of Garbage is probably my favorite episode of the first season, and it introduces a hilarious sci-fi concept in the midst of an anti-pollution driven plotline. They actually kind of laid it on thick too, it's pretty funny.
Were it not for your 20th century garbage making skills, we'd all be buried under 20th century garbage.
Now, not every season 1 episode was a banger. A Flight to Remember was ironically maybe not all that memorable. Mars University had some funny stuff in it, but didn't leave a huge impact on me personally. But we also got episodes like Hell is Other Robots, which to this day is considered one of the best the show has to offer, introducing the incredible side character, the Robot Devil, who would go on to play major parts in important episodes of the series. He was also played by the legend Dan Castellaneta, aka Homer Simpson. And can we talk about the song?
Here on level 1 of Robot Hell.
The season even rounded out with one of their most beloved parodies, Fry and the Slurm Factory, a play on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And while I prefer the more original stories in Futurama to the straight-up parodies, it's hard not to love this episode.
Runka-lunka dunkety darn guards. Shut the hell up!
All in all, Futurama started off strong. The animation itself was a bit looser than you'd come to expect later, but much less so than first seasons of shows like The Simpsons, Family Guy, or King of the Hill. It also would establish our characters and our world building in incredibly effective ways, and it tugged at the heartstrings through that emotional core that I continued to mention. But things would really only get better from there because Season 2 continued to grow the series in hilarious and memorable ways. Though I think that Season 2 maybe dials back on the emotional core a tad bit after getting so many great moments in Season 1, it absolutely dials up the comedy and sci-fi in really funny ways. The first episode of the season, I Second That Emotion, introduces us to the mutants who live under New York, and even throws a little Easter egg in the mix for long-running mystery in the series. They pretty immediately expand on characters like Zap Brannigan and Brannigan Begin Again, and firmly establish him as a comedic powerhouse.
What makes a man turn neutral? Lust for gold? Power? Or were you just born with a heart full of neutrality?
And of course, they introduced the character who would maintain his position as president of Earth throughout the remainder of the series, Richard Nixon. Overall, season 2 does a ton right. Episodes that put a focus on secondary characters like Brannigan Begin Again, Why Must I Be a Crustacean in Love, and how Hermes requisitioned his groove back showed that the series didn't need to just rely on its primary characters for effective storytelling. Interestingly, season 2 doesn't overly rely on pure sci-fi either, opting to take a lot of fun sitcom ideas, concepts, and themes, and rolling in a sci-fi twist. XMAS Story takes the Christmas episode concept and adds in a murderous, rampaging robot Santa who has been programmed to judge everyone as naughty. Put Your Head on My Shoulders throws Fry and Amy into a surprise relationship. The typical sitcom idea here would generally be that when they break up, they have to deal with working in close quarters at Planet Express, but instead Futurama dials that up a notch and has Fry's disembodied head temporarily attached to Amy, making their breakup that much more difficult. Why Must I Be a Crustacean in Love has Fry attempt to coach Zoidberg in his dating life, with the added caveat that Zoidberg's alien species has a drastically different form of procreation. It's a really fun formula that they would continue to use effectively through to the end of the series. Season 2 also started to dig a bit more into some long-running mysteries and storylines. While there was a nice moment in Season 1's A Flight to Remember, XMAS Story was probably the first big step in the Fry and Leela romance that would run through to the finale of the show. What I love about this episode is that it firmly establishes Fry and Leela's connection outside of romance. It's initially a purely platonic bond formed through their mutual loneliness. While Fry lamented the fact that he left all of his friends and family back in the year 2000, Leela similarly lamented her lifetime as an orphan who never knew her parents.
Here I am whining like a pig, while all along Leela was as lonely as a frog.
And yeah, the episode does have them almost kiss when they were faced with what they believed to be imminent death, but the moment that I think meant the most to their development was this one.
Leela! Oh my god, you saved my life. I am gonna get you so many lizards.
Nah, just kidding. Actually, this one.
It's okay. You're lonely and I'm lonely. But together, we're lonely together.
The show really established itself as being willing to slow down and embrace these smaller, grounded, and emotional character moments, and I think that's what made it both stand out and allowed it to stand the test of time, especially given that a lot of these character arcs would be serialized throughout the run, something you didn't really see from network animated sitcoms back in the day. Speaking of serialized character arcs, they also really started to dig into the mystery of Leela's origins in the season too. Besides the moment in XMAS Story that focused on her loneliness, there was also the aforementioned mutant hint in episode 201, but most prominently was the episode A Bicyclops Built for Two, in which Leela believes that she has found the only other remaining member of her species.
We are the last remaining Cyclopses. Our planet is Cyclopia. This is the capital, Cyclops City. Stop me if I'm going too fast for you.
It's a really great episode that shows how important Leela's desire to find a sense of belonging in her origins and history is to her. Because though she meets this other Cyclops and has an opportunity to save her species, she also quickly learns that he's an asshole and that she doesn't like him. It's a tough scenario where Leela's head and heart are at odds with one another. In the end, it turns out that the other Cyclops, Alcazar, was a con man and not a Cyclops at all, so they didn't go through with the marriage. But the episode went a long way to show how important finding where she came from is to Leela. And I would be hard-pressed not to talk about the problem with poplars, probably one of the most popular episodes of Futurama. Honestly, before Futurama became one of my favorite series, this was the episode that always came to mind when I thought about the show. It's just a straight-up good time.
Pop a poplar in your mouth when you come to Fishy Joe's. What they're made of is a mystery. Where they come from, no one knows.
The episode combines a really fun and unique premise with a great sci-fi twist when they realize that the food they've been collecting and selling is actually the offspring of an alien species. The episode also establishes what would be a long-running bit, the Waterfall family, as Free Waterfall Jr. fights for animal rights.
We're with mankind for ethical animal treatment.
And of course gets eaten by Lur of the planet Omicron Persei 8.
This is not happening.
Though I think my absolute favorite sequence in all of Season 2 has to be the finale musical number in How Hermes Requisitioned His Groove Back. Just an incredibly fun song with so many memorable lines, but also really well directed and animated. So like I said, while Season 2 maybe dialed back a tad on the emotional core of the series, it didn't abandon it entirely, and it also just continued to cement the show as a smart comedic juggernaut, all while establishing some of the most beloved and memorable through lines that the series had to offer. It was an excellent sophomore effort that would pave the way for what is, in my opinion, the strongest run of the show, with Season 3. Futurama's third production season, right off the bat, hit us with what many consider to be one of the strongest episodes of the series, Amazon Women in the Mood. While I'm not quite as high on this episode as many others, I do think it's hard to deny that it's very funny. A great follow-up to a couple of ongoing stories, Leela's repulsion for Zap Brannigan, and of course, Kif and Amy's budding romance. This one pretty immediately hit the show with some incredible humor.
She's built like a steakhouse, but she handles like a bistro.
And while I find that the differences between men and women humor that it overly relies on didn't quite age as well as a lot of the other humor in the show, there are some really great moments. But the second episode the season has to offer, Parasites Lost, is in my opinion one of the absolute finest the show has ever produced. I can't express how much I love this episode. When Fry gets parasitic worms that basically push his body and mind to operate at peak efficiency, the crew does their own fantastic voyage to try and eliminate the worms from his system.
Where are we, the ass?
But Fry's newfound mental clarity also helps Leela see his potential, and Fry confesses his love.
Leela, I love you.
This is a plot point that would continue to be important through the entire series, that Fry and Leela have an undeniable connection and bond, but Fry's immaturity poses issues with his viability as boyfriend material. And though their romance in Parasites Lost goes incredibly well, including one of the most beautiful sequences in the series when Fry plays the holophoner for Leela, Fry worries that Leela only loves him for what the worms have made him. Fry wants to get there on his own.
Oh, Fry, I love what you've become.
What I've become.
Fry eliminating the worms from his own system is bold and heartbreaking, and also just such a fun science fiction idea.
He's bluffing. No creature would willingly make an idiot out of itself.
Obviously, you've never been in love.
I can't express enough how much I love this episode. But we've got to move on because literally 2 episodes later is one of the absolute greatest episodes of television history, honestly. And what was for a long time my favorite episode of the entire run of Futurama, The Luck of the Fryrish. I cannot say enough about this episode. It's truly one of the most well-written pieces of television I've ever seen. Absolutely hilarious, but maintains an honest and emotional character through line with Fry's anger over his past with his brother, who he now believes stole his identity after he disappeared.
That clover helped my rat-fink brother steal my dream of going into space. Now I'll never get there.
You went there this morning for donuts.
This was the first time the show really utilized flashbacks to Fry's past and its story structure, something they would do a few more times over the series. But the end of the episode is where it really delivers the strong emotional gut punch. Fry learns that his brother in fact did not steal his identity. He actually named his son after Fry.
I'm naming you Philip J. Fry in honor of my little brother, who I miss every day.
God, that just hurts every damn time to watch. What a good episode. And this was literally all within 4 episodes of the 3rd season. Not every episode of this run was a banger, but it absolutely has a collection of some of the best episodes the show has to offer. The Day the Earth Stood Stupid started to explore a long-standing mystery that David Cohen and co. had planned from the very beginning, the idea that Fry had been sent to the future because he had a role to play with universal implications. And this creates for a very fun episode with giant brains that make everyone except for Fry very dumb.
Ow! Fire hot!
The prophecy will help. Fire indeed hot.
We'll talk more about this as they follow it up, but it's another really strong episode in Season 3. The season is also filled with what I consider to be very underrated classics, like Insane in the Mainframe, when Fry and Bender are both sent to a robot insane asylum. This one introduces Roberto, who is truly one of the funniest side characters ever created.
Now stand back, I gotta practice my stabbing.
Bendin' in the Wind is another that I feel is very underrated, utilizing its guest voice musician Beck in hilarious ways that actually build on what we know about Bender as a character. It's really fun stuff.
With real words, not phony ones like odelay.
Odelay is a word. Just look it up in the Bectionary.
And the season closes out with some of the show's best episodes. The final 9 episodes include 3 all-timers, Time Keeps on Slippin', Roswell That Ends Well, and Godfellas, as well as the very underrated Future Stock. Time Keeps on Slippin' is another that follows up the Fry and Leela romance arc in exciting and heartbreaking ways, all through another amazing sci-fi premise in which time starts to skip ahead at random intervals, causing a mass confusion. It also establishes the Globetrotters as a hilarious group of side characters, and of course ends with one of the most heartbreaking moments of the series. During a time skip, Fry somehow wins over Leela and the two get married, but because time skipped, neither of them remember how or why it happened, resulting in their immediate divorce. As the episode closes, Fry sees exactly what he did to win over Leela, moving the stars themselves to write her a love note just before it's destroyed forever, with Leela never seeing the message. Big oof. Roswell That Ends Well is another of the most beloved and memorable episodes of the show as well, and it even won Futurama their very first Emmy Award. The episode attempts to explain the infamous Roswell, New Mexico UFO incident through the Planet Express crew's accidental time travel, which creates for some absolutely hilarious moments in the past, obviously an era that we had yet to see in the series.
Fellas, this visit's top secret. No one's to know about it, except the senior officers, scientists, and a single conspiracy not no one will believe.
But what makes this episode most memorable is the so-called nasty in the pasty, where we learned that Fry accidentally became his own grandfather.
Did you say something, dearie?
This also ultimately explains why Fry was so important in saving the universe from the brain spawn. Being his own grandfather is why he has no delta brainwave, and why he can survive their dumbification. And then Godfellas is just a damn work of art, an episode I've loved for as long as I can remember. Bender is accidentally launched through space, and first he becomes a god, and then he meets a god. It's a beautiful and existential episode that builds on Bender's own insecurities as a character who craves validation through a desire to be loved and remembered. And ultimately, Bender being loved and remembered by his best friend Fry is what saved him from a cruel fate of eternal floating.
I wish I had Bender back.
The show was starting to get really ambitious, as the last 3 episodes I talked about really establish, and it continued to just knock these episodes out of the park too. But that isn't to say that season 3 was perfect either. It maybe ends a little underwhelmingly with the 30% Iron Chef, a decent episode, but not the most exciting finale. Even though it establishes a new character, Hermes' son Dwight, The Route of All Evil stands out to me as a pretty lackluster episode, and Where the Buggalo Roam is not only a pretty mediocre episode comedically, it's full of really frustrating and problematic Native American stereotypes that play as both offensive and lazy. It's definitely one of my least favorite episodes, but season 3 was basically when Futurama hit its stride and really showcased its potential to the highest degree. It has probably 6 or 7 episodes that sit in my top 15 of the entire show, and it also just fully took hold of that emotional core that the show is known for, leaning hard into strong emotional character moments, all while never sacrificing the incredible comedy or sci-fi. And this is a trend that would continue into Futurama's final season of its original run on Fox. Though I think this final run doesn't quite hit with the same consistency of season 3, it has some of the best episodes of the show. While the season maybe starts off a little weak overall, with the first 6 episodes of the season having 5 episodes that I think are average or below, there's Kif Gets Knocked Up a Notch, Love and Rocket, Less Than Hero, and A Taste of Freedom. All are fine episodes, but nothing to write home about. But it also gave us Leela's Homeworld, an episode that the entire series had been building up to. I actually did an entire video on this episode, but it's hard to overstate just how excellent Leela's Homeworld is. The episode finally reveals exactly where Leela came from, and though we had been led to believe the entire run that she was an alien abandoned on Earth as a child, it turns out that she is actually a mutated human, the least mutated mutant of all time in fact, which led to her parents deciding to leave her in an orphanarium on the surface to give her a better life than she could hope to achieve in the sewers. It's an incredibly heartwarming episode and an absolutely masterful reveal, one of the best the show has ever had. The ending showcases a montage where we see that for her entire life, Leela's parents had actually been watching out for her, even though she didn't realize it, and it stands as one of the most emotionally affecting sequences in all of Futurama. I could go on for a while about this episode, but I already did that in the other video, so if you want to hear more about why this reveal was so effective, check that one out. And speaking of emotionally affecting, we've arrived at the most infamous episode of Futurama, Jurassic Bark. Yeah, it's the one with Fry's dog. So get your tissues ready. This was the second time the series utilized these flashbacks to Fry's past and the story structure, and once again it worked incredibly well. Fry discovers the fossilized remains of his dog at a museum exhibit, and then has an opportunity to bring him back from the dead with Farnsworth's help.
Know ye now what it feels like to be dog-god?
Fry ultimately changes his mind when he learns that Seymour lived a long life, but oh boy, I know I don't have to remind you about this emotional gut punch.
I'll never forget him. But he forgot me a long, long time ago.
This obviously turned out to not be true, as we see at the end of the episode that Seymour actually waited the remainder of his life for Fry to return. No joke, it makes me tear up just writing those words in the script right now. It's one of the most painful moments I've ever seen in television, and I think a lot of people agree with me there. The episode is great for many other reasons too. It's very funny, but also has an important subplot focusing on Bender's insecurities once again, as he becomes jealous of Fry's excitement to reconnect with Seymour. But obviously it's remembered for that ending. I don't think there are any episodes of the show that had a more lasting impact on its fandom than Jurassic Bark. The season would continue in its ambition too. The Why of Fry follows up the brain spawn story, as Fry has to stop the giant floating brains once and for all, but not before he learns the terrible truth that the writers had planned from the very beginning. Fry had actually been pushed into the freezer by Nibbler, who needed Fry to exist in the future so that he could stop the brain spawn. Fry basically learns that the most important event in his life was not actually just happenstance, but something that somebody did to him. It's pretty emotional.
You were the only one who could help us. What is one life weighed against the entire universe?
But it was my life.
Fry is actually given a chance to change the past, but opts not to, because of his friends and Leela specifically. It's a really, really nice moment, especially in what was looking like it would be the final season of Futurama. The entire back half of this final Fox season has some really strong stuff. Teenage Mutant Leela's Hurdles, Where No Fan Has Gone Before, and 300 Big Boys stand out as incredibly fun episodes that probably get overlooked. The Farnsworth Parabox is without a doubt one of the best the show has ever made, with not only an amazing sci-fi premise, but with some incredibly funny comedic moments.
1 year later, I gave Leela a diamond scrunchie, and we were married. 1 year later, I got beat up at a Neil Diamond concert by a guy named Scrunchy.
But the episode that I really want to talk about is The Sting, which I believe to be one of the greatest pieces of television that has ever graced our screens. It's truly something so unbelievably special. I know you've all watched the show before, so you know the twist, but the gist is that the episode all takes place in Leela's trippy coma dream in which she thinks Fry has been killed, sacrificing himself to save her. It has some of my favorite sequences in animation history, and the entire episode has this sort of scary, dreamy vibe that we've never seen in any other episode of Futurama.
I love you.
I'm so scared, Fry. I don't know what to do.
Just wake up, Leela. Please, just wake up.
But the ultimate reveal that it was all Leela's coma dream is so ridiculously effective, and not just because it was a surprising twist, but because of the subtle details in the end of the episode that tie everything together so beautifully. Leela dreams that Fry gave her a gift, and that he put her jacket on her when she was cold, and that they were traveling together on a sleigh through these ice fields. The end of the episode shows that Fry had left a gift at her nightstand, that he had put his jacket around her while she was sleeping, and that the television was showcasing those very ice fields that they traveled through in the dream. Fry sat at Leela's side and spoke to her the entire time.
It got through, Fry. It got through.
It's just one of the most brilliantly conceived episodes of anything I've ever seen, and it all ties into our ongoing investment in Fry and Leela's connection. It's my favorite episode of Futurama, and I honestly can't say that enough times. But though this season does have some of Futurama's best efforts, it also has some low points. I mentioned before that the season starts a little slowly with a slew of average or forgettable episodes, but it also features probably the worst episode of the show, Ben-Hur, which is just fundamentally transphobic and a huge bummer. I was never a huge fan of this one outside of the introduction of Barbados Slim, but it's aged even worse than you can imagine, and I genuinely just skip over it when I rewatch the show. Honestly, as great as Futurama is, it definitely had its brushes with homophobic and transphobic humor, even in strong episodes. Obviously, this was the case for a lot of shows that aired in this era, but Futurama being such a strong and in a lot of other ways progressive show, it's a bummer to see. Obviously, that isn't to say the show can't be enjoyed in spite of these jokes, it's just important to acknowledge them. But with that, let's talk about the very first series finale the show ever had. And another of my absolute favorite episodes, probably in my top 3. The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings ended Futurama for the first time on the best imaginable note. This episode is not only so funny, but so emotionally impacting in a way that leaves you somehow paradoxically satisfied and desperate to see what comes next. It's an incredible episode of television and a really strong finale. Fry makes a deal with the robot devil and swaps hands with him so that he can play the holophoner well again, all in an attempt to win over Leela once and for all. With his new hands, Fry becomes an incredible musician and writes an entire opera about Leela and his love for her. It all culminates in the robot devil's own trickery. Through a deal with Bender, he causes Leela to become deaf and then tricks Leela into trading him her hand in marriage so that she can hear Fry's opera for her. Fry then must choose between losing the woman he loves or losing the hands that made her fall in love with him in the first place. Just a masterfully written deal with the devil storyline. The end of the Fox era of Futurama is perfect. It's one of the best moments the series has to offer, as Fry sits down and plays one last song for Leela, even though he's lost his skills.
Please don't stop playing, Fry. I want to hear how it ends.
The series ends for the first time with Fry playing music for Leela, and a vision of himself and Leela kissing and walking off into the sunset together. And then, it was over. For a long time, this was the final piece of Futurama that ever existed. And though when I was younger, all I ever wanted was to see what happened next, I do think that if this had been the very end for Futurama, I would have ultimately been satisfied. It's such a good episode that gives us a glimpse at a possible future for our characters, all while celebrating the journey they've gone on. They absolutely stuck the landing with this episode. The Fox era of Futurama, in my opinion, is one of the greatest stretches of television writing that has ever existed. No, it isn't perfect. There are some lackluster episodes episodes and even some dated and problematic stories that don't age well, but it's hard to deny what the show was able to accomplish in its 4 production seasons. Emerging from the shadow of The Simpsons to establish itself as its own special and unique type of animated sitcom, experimenting with types of storytelling that hadn't really been heard of in network sitcom format at the time, and really embracing an emotional, character-based type of storytelling that would keep fans coming back for more, even fighting through their own tears. It's hard to describe how much I love and appreciate this original run of Futurama, and while there are stories and episodes that I absolutely love from the remaining eras of the show, the DVD movies and the Comedy Central seasons, the Fox run will always be what Futurama is for me. There's just something special about these stories and these characters, and I think that this was felt in its fan base, because though shows like The Simpsons might be bigger, it's hard to think of a more dedicated and invested fan base than Futurama, a fan base that stuck with them through multiple cancellations and revivals, and to this day will watch an idiot like me ramble about the show thousands of times. The golden era of Futurama was truly something special. When people talk about the full run of Futurama, they tend to divide it into 2 categories: the original Fox seasons and the Comedy Central revival seasons, the first run and the second run, which is actually a fair assessment. Technically, production seasons 1 through 4 aired on Fox, while 5 through 7 aired on Comedy Central. However, production season 5 is sort of an outlier because while it did eventually air on Comedy Central, initially it went straight to DVD in the form of 4 movies. This is why personally I see Futurama as existing in 3 different eras, because these straight to DVD movies absolutely feel like their own thing and wedge themselves firmly in between the 2 broadcast runs of the show, bridging that gap. So today, let's dive into the seemingly forgotten era of Futurama and talk about Bender's Big Score, The Beast with a Billionbacks, Bender's Game, and Into the Wild Green Yonder. I've talked about how Futurama was revived a ton on both my channel and my podcast, Cartoons That Curse, but since this is a new video, I'll do a little abridged rundown of how the revival came to be. Futurama ended on Fox in 2003, but thanks to its syndication success on Adult Swim, as well as great DVD sales for the first 4 seasons, the show was granted a revival in the form of 4 straight-to-DVD movies, starting with Bender's Big Score in 2007. In one of the DVD commentaries for these movies, I can't remember exactly which one, David X. Cohen said that they had initially wanted to do only 2 movies, but pitched the studio 4 movies, expecting them to haggle down to the 2 that they actually wanted, but Fox ended up saying yes when they asked for 4. The way this season was written was actually quite a bit different than the series. A small team of writers assembled to brainstorm and break story ideas for the films, but eventually each screenplay was assigned to a different writer. Because of the longer production cycle and these movies not being part of an ongoing series, it doesn't appear that they benefited from having an ongoing writer's room for the duration of their production, a luxury of the original run. The season is really interesting to me. I actually have a ton of nostalgia for all 4 of these movies, and it's hard to describe how excited I was when they were announced, but they're definitely these outliers in the production because they were written and produced so differently than either the original run or revival seasons. Each movie was technically made up of 4 episodes apiece, and eventually each movie was trimmed down so that they could broadcast each movie as 4 separate episodes. So to anyone who saw them this way, this could just feel like a season with 4 serialized arcs rather than 4 movies. This is actually how they're currently listed on Hulu, each movie divided into 4 episodes each. I'm curious if any of you have only seen these movies in episodic form, so comment below if this was how you watched them for the first time and how that affected your opinion of season 5 overall. But also, there are extra jokes in the full movie version, so it might be worth going to watch those if you haven't seen them. The small writers' room gathered to brainstorm in 2005, and on November 27th, 2007, the first Futurama movie Bender's Big Score was released on DVD. And I gotta say, I will defend Bender's Big Score until the day I die. This movie stands as one of my favorite Futurama stories. It is seriously something special. In fact, I've talked about it a lot already in these videos and also this podcast episode, so if this video doesn't fully scratch that itch, feel free to check those out. Bender's Big Score did everything I hoped it would do. It brought back the series on a much grander scale, gave us emotional character-based storytelling, and an incredible time travel sci-fi plot with twists and turns aplenty. Honestly, I feel like I could have gone to see Bender's Big Score on the big screen and been completely satisfied with it as a cinematic experience. And that shouldn't be too big of a surprise. It was written by Ken Keeler, who has written some of the best episodes in all of Futurama, including every single series finale they ever did. Even though these were written sort of as a 4-episode mini arc, Bender's Big Score feels really cohesive overall, and most importantly, the character work is excellent. This is something I talk about at length in another video, but the Fry and Leela focused story is truly something special in Bender's Big Score. Leela falls for a guy named Lars in a whirlwind romance, which obviously upsets Fry, Fry, but through the time travel shenanigans, we eventually learn that Lars is in fact a time paradox duplicate of Fry, who lived out a separate life back in the 2000s. Lars is basically a Fry who has grown and emotionally matured, which is obviously very attractive to Leela. She's said this before.
Fry is very sweet, but he's so immature. I love his boyish charm, but I hate his childishness.
And while watching the film the first time makes you sort of hate Lars because he's interfering with the Fry and Leela romance, on rewatch, knowing who he is, it makes all of these sequences really endearing.
I don't know who I am anymore.
I know who you are. You're the woman I've been waiting for all my life.
My favorite is actually this date montage. It's really lovely and you can feel their romance and connection growing, even though it hurts Fry in the process. But the coolest part about the Lars-Leela storyline is that Lars actually propels our version of Fry's growth forward faster than he might have grown otherwise. Lars' experience in the 2000s actually taught him the selflessness he needed. He learned that letting Leela go was actually the best thing for her, and that if he truly cared about her, that her happiness needed to come first.
You too. It's enough to know you're happy with Lars.
This was, of course, before he realized that he himself was the very Lars he was jealous of.
I'm Lars? I'm Lars!
But Lars' romance with Leela actually propels Fry forward in that same exact way, and Fry shows that same selflessness in the face of his own heartbreak. It's a really cool way to tell this story because ultimately we actually spend much more time with Lars in Bender's Big Score than we do with our Fry. But through Lars' journey, we understand and see that important growth in Fry. And at the end of the movie, we get this lovely little button with Fry and Leela.
He was a good man, Leela.
Yeah, you were.
Now, as much as I adore Bender's Big Score, that isn't to say I thought it was perfect. I did think that the nude scammer villains left a little bit to be desired. They had some really funny sequences, but the story itself felt bigger and more grand than its villains. It also brings in the Nibelonians for about 1 minute before they're knocked out of the picture for the remainder of the film.
Our kitten-class attack ships were no match for their mighty chairs.
But it also used other side characters really effectively. The Harlem Globetrotters are hilarious as always, and Robot Santa makes a couple very funny appearances, including a hysterical song with the Hanukkah Zombie and Kwanzaa Bot. And while I did find the subplot with Hermes' severed head to be pretty entertaining, LaBarbra's lack of support for Hermes felt like a stark contrast to the relationship we'd seen from them in the original run, though I do understand that the writers really wanted to include Barbados Slim. And to top everything off, the film ended on a pretty wild cliffhanger, with the time paradox duplicates of Bender creating a massive tear in the universe. Nibbler even eats himself to escape. And this giant tear in the universe would play a massive role in the second straight-to-DVD movie, The Beast with the Billionbacks, which would release on June 24th, 2008, about 7 months after Bender's Big Score. At the time, The Beast with the Billionbacks was not nearly as well received as Bender's Big Score. The screenplay was written by Eric Kaplan, and while it did focus on the giant rip in the universe caused in Bender's Big Score, it definitely doesn't feel like a sequel to that film, which personally I think is a good thing. I have to admit, when I saw The Beast with the Billionbacks for the first time, I did not love it. And initially, this was my least favorite of all 4 of these Futurama movies. However, the more time I've spent watching these movies, the more this one has grown on me. While I still think much of this story leaves a lot to be desired, I also think that it is a very funny movie. There are some seriously classic Futurama jokes and moments throughout it, including one so legendary that I laugh every single time I think about it.
I knew you'd come back!
Here you go.
But unlike Bender's Big Score, this is where you can really start to see the seams of the story a bit more clearly. The transitions between each of the 4 episodes of the movie are a little more clear. They immediately introduce a new love interest for Fry, Colleen, who admittedly is a very funny character, driven by an excellent Brittany Murphy performance. Rest in peace to a legend. This story is basically all about jealousy. Fry enters a polyamorous relationship with Colleen, who is dating and lives with a handful of other men already, and while he thinks he can look past this, he decides he can't handle this kind of relationship. But by the end of the movie, Fry is spearheading the biggest polyamorous relationship in history, as he's basically the spokesperson for the interdimensional being Yivo, who lives on the other side of the giant hole in the universe. Fry basically recruits the remainder of society into the cult of Yivo, who then all attempt to date Shkler simultaneously. Eventually, the entire universe decides to move in with Yivo, mirroring Fry's decision with Colleen at the beginning of the film. But since only organic matter can pass through the tear in the universe, Bender and all the other robots are left behind, which basically leads to Bender's jealousy story that his friend Fry has left him for someone new. There's also a subplot where Amy sleeps with Zap after Kif is killed in an assault on Yivo, which leads to further jealousy from Kif after he's revived. Even the Professor and Wernstrom's rivalry contains a ton of professional jealousy as they fight over who can or should solve the issues at hand. So yeah, thematically, this film is all about jealousy and relationships, which I can definitely appreciate in broad strokes. They did a good job making sure that every subplot of the story had ties to this overall theme, and I think that really helps the movie overall. However, while the themes all tie, the plot still feels a bit disjointed, at least compared to the previous film. The second episode in particular feels very disconnected from everything else, introducing the League of Robots into Bender's story, but sort of moving away from the Colleen stuff, and relegating the giant tear in the universe to the background for a bit. In fact, it almost felt to me like the League of Robots could have or should have been its own episode of Futurama, like maybe it was an idea they had in the original run that they shoehorned into this movie, though I can't say that for sure. But in the end, I still have a lot of fondness for The Beast with a Billion Backs. It's incredibly funny, has some great performances, and does some really interesting work with its theming across all of its subplots. Plus, it has one final voiceover performance from Brittany Murphy, and she's really great in the role.
I've got good wine, 5 sweethearts, and today I was promoted to Chief of Police.
There are also some really awesomely conceived and directed sequences animation-wise. The Nimbus flying around and attacking the tentacles is really cool. I always love this duel scene between Bender and Calculon. It's super creative, and I low-key love the sequence where everyone starts to leave the universe to head to Yivo, like a mass ascension to heaven. Really great stuff. Interestingly though, they chose not to leave off any sort of cliffhanger that sets up the following film, Bender's Game, like they did between the first 2 films, which personally I didn't love. I think they should have either gone all in on connecting the 4 movies or not at all, though I don't really have any pitch on how they could have connected the second and third movies, but they should have done it. And speaking of, let's talk about the third film, Bender's Game, which released on November 4th, 2008. This film was written a bit differently than the others, as it has 5 credited writers who all tackled different episodes of the story. Parts 1 and 2 were written by Eric Horsted, Part 3 was written by Michael Rowe and Eric Kaplan, and Part 4 was penned by David X. Cohen and Patrick Verone, though it is worth noting that the story credit goes to both Eric Horsted and David X. Cohen. But I think these writing credits are pretty important for Bender's Game because this is the Futurama movie that absolutely does not feel like a movie. So these different writers tackling all the different parts of the story makes a lot of sense after watching it. Parts 1 and 2 of Bender's Game feel sort of related, but very much operate as separate episodes. Parts 3 and 4 definitely feel more connected to each other, but completely disconnected from the first 2 parts. The main through line of this story is Bender's overactive imagination causing him to roleplay as a fantasy character named Titanius Anglesmith. Part 1 details his descent into madness and complete detachment from reality, which admittedly can be very funny at times. Part 2 completes that descent to madness by showing Bender institutionalized in the same robot insane asylum we saw back in the original run in the episode Insane in the Mainframe. I also have to admit that I really like a lot of this stuff. Insane in the Mainframe is a great episode, and seeing a lot of these characters again was really fun.
I was designed by a team of engineers attempting to build an insane robot, but it seems they failed.
But running simultaneous to this Bender stuff are some tough to follow stories about Mom, Farnsworth, and the existence of dark matter as fuel in the universe, plus some weird Leela anger stuff complete with shock therapy. They attempt to tie all of these stories together for parts 3 and 4, but I honestly still don't even fully understand how it works. They basically use this dark matter sci-fi story to facilitate the creation of this fantasy world through Bender's imagination. So parts 3 and 4 of Bender's Game are a full-on fantasy world parody. But personally, these last 2 parts don't work for me at all. They really feel like nothing more than a parody of better fantasy stories, whereas Futurama was always best making its sci-fi premises feel unique to its own world building, even if they were inspired by other sci-fi material. It's especially noticeable after watching 3 seasons of Disenchantment, which does a significantly better job building out its own world and lore in a fantasy setting, rather than feeling like a comedy knockoff of existing worlds. It is always jarring to me when this movie switches between the sci-fi world and the fantasy world. I appreciate that they tried to tie the stories together and explain it through the sci-fi, but it never quite works for me. I think the first 2 parts of Bender's Game have enough going on comedically to keep me pretty engaged, but I just simply am not a fan of the fantasy episodes. More than any of these 4 movies, this one feels like a series of loosely connected episodes instead of one cohesive story. I also have to say that I have a ton of frustrations about a certain reveal in this episode. We learn that Mom's son Ignor is actually Professor Farnsworth's son as well, which I think makes a ton of sense given the context of the series, but they absolutely never bring the storyline up again in the remainder remainder of the show, which seems like a major missed opportunity. They also reintroduced Nibbler in the episode without ever explaining how he returned after eating himself at the end of Bender's Big Score, and they also very clumsily explain why they're not surprised he can talk.
Hey, wait. Aren't you amazed I can speak?
Well, actually, no. You forgot to blank our memories after you spoke last time.
Okay, but if Nibbler had been wiping your memories, then how did you know he ever wiped your memory? This is a dumb piece of dialogue and only makes sense to the audience and wouldn't make sense to the characters. So yeah, overall, not a huge fan of Bender's Game. I think some of it works and is funny, but the success of the episodes rests on the fantasy parody, which I think doesn't work particularly well. It does have interesting ramifications for the Futurama world at large. The result of this film is that dark matter no longer functions as a fuel source, so the remainder of the series, the ships use whale oil instead, which is pretty funny. Also, I laugh at this line every single time.
Huh. So that's why they call me the Catman.
And that brings us to the final Futurama film, Into the Wild Green Yonder, once again written by Ken Keeler. This is a really interesting one because it was written as though it could have been a series finale, something that they had to do 4 times over the course of Futurama. And while I do think this movie does a lot of great work in the finale department, as a story, it feels a bit overstuffed. They go to great lengths to make this one have a larger scale, but personally it still doesn't feel as grand as Bender's Big Score, which is a bit of a bummer. This movie also ties a few long-standing threads from Futurama's original run into the story, finally revealing who this dude with the number 9 shirt is, a background character who they allegedly had plans for throughout the entire series, as well as bringing us the finale of the Free Waterfall saga. If you didn't know, the Waterfall family is a family of activists first introduced in The Problem with Poplars. Every time a member of the family is featured in an episode, they die at the end, sort of a weird little underlying story arc. The movie does start with an incredible opening sequence with a song sung by Seth MacFarlane, and I have to say, this song gets stuck in my head regularly. I really appreciated the entire intro, and it's cool that Seth came in to sing this song for him.
You and I will be reborn in a future place and time.
But again, the movie really does feel overstuffed. The first story is all about Fry getting in an accident that gives him mind-reading abilities while Bender has an affair with the Donbot's wife. The two of them both enter a poker tournament, which, saying all of it out loud, makes it feel really disconnected from the overall plot. The real through line of the film are Fry's mind-reading and introduction to the Legion of Madfellows, and Leela joining the eco-feminist collective that protests across the solar system. And I think what works best about this movie overall is how it ties Fry and Leela's stories together. As it turns out, Fry's mission from the Legion of Madfellows and Leela's mission in her eco-feminist collective are one and the same, to save the Violet Dwarf Star from being destroyed. However, because of an ancient evil known as the Dark One, which can read thoughts, nobody except for Fry can have a plan to stop the Dark One from destroying the star, since his lack of a delta brainwave makes it impossible for his thoughts to be read. So the plan can't be learned by the Dark One. Every time I explain this plot point in a video, it sounds so convoluted. I'm kind of tired of talking about it. But I do think it works well with Fry and Leela's story. Early on in the movie, Leela and some protesters are accidentally responsible for the death of Vice President Agnew, and so she goes on the run from the law. She tries to explain herself to Fry, but Fry doesn't actually need her to explain.
You're you. That's all I need to know.
This is a really sweet moment that shows how much Fry believes in Leela and how much he knows and understands her as a person. But at the end of the movie, Leela is struggling to afford Fry the same belief, as it appears as though Fry is working to destroy the Violet Dwarf Star and cannot tell her his true plan because of the Dark One. Fortunately, Leela eventually comes to her senses.
You're you. That's all I need to know.
I truly love these moments in the story and think that it's a really nice way to put Fry and Leela's relationship and bond at the forefront of the story, even in a movie where they're separated nearly the entire time. This final sequence also features pretty much every single character that has ever been in Futurama, which is nice for a send-off, and they even wrap up the waterfall story in a pretty massive way, which is fun for longtime fans of the show. And while it does feel a little tacked on, when the crew eventually escapes and is chased down by Zapp Brannigan, it leads to some really nice finale moments before what could have been the end of the series. Fry and Leela kiss, and the crew pushes forward into a wormhole, not knowing what their fate will be.
Into the breach, meatbags. Or not. Yeah, whatever.
Go, go, go!
I've always liked this final little stretch and think it would have been a solid ending had the show never returned, which of course it did. So yeah, there's a lot to like in Into the Wild Green Yonder, but I definitely think it's much less cohesive as a movie than the others, especially thematically, except for Bender's Game, of course. It feels like they could have done more to tie Fry and Leela's stuff into the story sooner, and some of the plot points in Leela's activist story start to feel really spread thin. They get caught, tried, arrested, sent to prison, and broken out, all in a matter of like 10 minutes. I think one of the biggest problems this movie is that it has this underlying theme of women being disrespected and treated unfairly by men and by society, while the script itself sort of also disrespects the female characters. It ends up reading like the writers and script are covering their protesting talking points in a sarcastic tone. Sometimes it feels like they're making commentary, but other times it feels like they're just reinforcing these same issues. But overall, Into the Wild Green Yonder does a lot of stuff right and sends Futurama off in a pretty satisfying way. So let's talk about this era of Futurama overall. Was it a success or was it a failure? Where does it stand in the history of the series? Well, personally, I think it was a mostly successful endeavor, even if they had some stumbles and missteps along the way. I'll forever appreciate that these movies exist and tried to tell Futurama stories in a new way. It was a fun experiment, and I think that if they had more time, they might have been able to perfect this style of storytelling for Futurama. Bender's Big Score will forever stand as one of my favorite Futurama stories, and while I don't love Bender's game, there is plenty that I enjoy and appreciate about The Beast with a Billion Backs and Into the Wild Green Yonder. I think if I could change anything about this movie season, it would have been to somehow shift these stories so that Bender's Big Score was the final film. That's the movie that felt the biggest and had the biggest ramifications for the character stories that we have been following for years in the original run. While I enjoy the Fry and Leela stuff that worked in Into the Wild Green Yonder, I don't think it worked as well as it did in Bender's Big Score. Plus, the time travel aspect of BBS actually works really well for a final film, feeding the audience some pretty great fan service with all of the connections to Fry's past and older episodes. It would have felt like these stories had been escalating to the biggest and most character-focused story. But that would have required a lot of rewrites and reworking, and overall, I'm still happy with how it went down, mostly. I think this era of Futurama actually probably goes underappreciated. They delivered some really fun stuff in a brand new format, something that is not easy to do. And while I'm glad that the series eventually came back and graced us with traditional TV episodes again, I'll always appreciate the risks that were taken and ambitious stories that were told in this weird little movie season. Alright, it's time to finish the trilogy. A few months ago, I did retrospectives on the first two eras of Futurama, the original run on Fox, and the 4 movies that went straight to DVD, and I promised that I'd eventually get to the final 52 episodes that aired on Comedy Central.
It's sort of a Comedy Central channel, and we're on it now.
I get it!
Well, that time has come. Today I'm going to give you my in-depth thoughts on the final run of Futurama, which to many is the weakest era of the show. There are plenty of people who even say the show should have never returned and should have ended after the original run, or after the DVD movies. My feelings are a bit more complicated, so let's get into it. In June 2009, just a few months after the release of the final DVD film Into the Wild Green Yonder, it was announced that Futurama had been renewed on Comedy Central. I was never more hyped for Futurama than the lead up to this return. Maybe leading up to the release of Bender's Big Score is comparable, but the fact that the show skirted cancellation for the second time and was coming back with traditionally formatted episodes was possibly the most excited I ever felt about any TV series. The series was picked up by Comedy Central for a production season of 26 episodes that would air over 2 broadcast seasons, both 13-episode runs. There were some caveats, however. With the new deal at Comedy Central came some cost-cutting measures. Initially, it was reported that due to the cost of the voice actors, they were going to recast literally every character on the show. Some speculate that this was just an attempt to gain leverage over the cast, and eventually a deal was made. Thank God. I'm not sure I would have even tuned in if the cast was different. But this was a symptom of the larger issue. The budget for the show had decreased, and this was showcased elsewhere. They were unable to maintain the full writers' room that they had at Fox, and unfortunately had to let a few writers go. But all in all, everyone was incredibly excited about the series' return. The straight-to-DVD films had received solid but mixed reactions, and I think fans were just excited to get back to the classic episodic format. On June 24th, 2010, Futurama returned with back-to-back episodes. The first, Rebirth, picked up immediately where the DVD movies had left off as the crew entered a wormhole, unsure if they'd make it out alive. As it turned out, they did.
Yeah, we're back.
However, the reactions to these first 2 return episodes were, I would say, mixed to negative. Personally, I enjoyed them, but wasn't particularly wowed. As the years have gone by, I found a bit more to like about Rebirth, but at the time, I was a little bit let down. Though I admit it did have to clean up a pretty major cliffhanger from the previous installment. I think in the end, the twists about these actually being robot versions of Fry and Leela didn't blow my mind like I may have expected from Futurama, and the humor felt a tad lacking. But I still appreciated that it had a lot of heart, one of the most important aspects of Futurama, to me anyways.
Well, you know how I feel. I waited for you for 1,000 years. I can wait a little longer.
The following episode, Inagata de Leela, had the opposite problem. I laughed a lot more this time around, but felt like the end of the episode really undermined the ongoing emotional story points. There was a ton of laughs to be had from Zap Brannigan, a fan favorite character, but for the end of the episode to be about Leela sleeping with Zap in just the second episode after Fry and Leela confessed their love for each other back in Into the Wild Green Yonder, I think this was ultimately a little bit of a miscalculation by the writers. It was exciting that the show was back, but I could sense a tiny bit of trepidation from the fan base based on these first 2 episodes. And this continued because the third of the season, Attack of the Killer App, is still one of my least favorites of the entire series. The problem here is that the episode felt too topical, revolving around the crew getting the new iPhone. iPhones had released during the hiatus between the 2 runs of the series, and this honestly just felt very un-Futurama-like. They did at least have their own sci-fi take on the iPhone concept, and the episode includes one of the most iconic Futurama memes of all time.
Shut up and take my money!
However, the one plot point that still to this day just makes me angry is Susan Boyle, a reference that already felt dated when the episode aired. Basically, the episode reveals that Leela secretly has this Boyle that sings. If you're unfamiliar, the real-life person Susan Boyle gained huge media attention when she shocked the judges and the world on Britain's Got Talent in 2009. It's a feel-good story, but I'm sorry, this hyper-literal Boyle that sings was just an incredibly painful concept. To this day, this is one of my least favorite jokes in Futurama. But after this episode, the season started to pick up a little bit of steam. Proposition Infinity, while also a little bit topical, had some really great Bender moments and world building. The following, the Da Vinci Code, had a fun mystery, plus the idea that Da Vinci is actually the dumbest alien on a planet of incredibly smart aliens is pretty funny conceptually.
Poor Leonardo da Vinci. He sure was stupid.
And then came Lethal Inspection, a true gem. This episode features the unlikely pairing of Bender and Hermes, who we truly haven't seen spend much time together up to this episode. When Bender discovers that he has no backup unit, meaning that his memory and personality could never be backed up into another machine if his body ever stopped working, he is sent into an existential crisis. Since Hermes worked for the central bureaucracy, he opts to help Bender discover why the mysterious Inspector 5 allowed Bender to leave the factory without a backup unit. The episode is filled with fun and oftentimes weird gags.
Sorry, Hermes. I drank all your white out.
But the real highlight is how through this journey, Bender and Hermes actually start to connect and form a friendship.
Hermes, remember that flock of bats? I sure do. That was fun.
And when ultimately they're unable to solve the Inspector 5 mystery, there are some really sweet moments between the pair of them.
There, man. It's gonna be okay. You are Bender, which is something Inspector 5 will never be.
But the real heartstring tugging moment comes in the final reveal, where we see Hermes burn Inspector 5's file, revealing that he was Inspector 5. Then we get a flashback with the most adorable baby Bender you could possibly imagine, revealing that a young Hermes didn't have the heart to dispose of him when the backup unit was shown to be faulty. This moment is just top-notch Futurama, and it was the first time watching this first revival season that actually blew my mind as a Futurama fan. And they weren't done yet, because the follow-up episode was The Late Philip J. Fry, which is undoubtedly an all-time great episode. I talk about it in great detail in this video that I made a couple years back, so I won't go over the plot points beat for beat, but this episode really does have it all. It's an incredible sci-fi premise featuring the professor's newly built forward-moving time machine, you know, so that they don't mess anything up in the past.
Or do something disgusting, like sleep with your own grandmother.
I wouldn't want to do that again.
But as Fry is recording a video greeting on Leela's birthday card, they accidentally fling themselves forward in time. The card flies out of the machine, and the trio lands in the year 10,000, trapping them there. This also leads Leela to believe that Fry stood her up on her birthday to go to a party, and then died in an explosion at said party. The episode cuts between Fry, Bender, and the Professor moving forward in time, desperately searching for backwards time-traveling technology, and Leela's time-running Planet Express in the decades following the trio's disappearance. We see a ton of different time periods in the far future, which is a bunch of fun, and also a pretty successful future for Planet Express under Leela's leadership. But Leela spends her entire life resenting Fry for blowing her off before his untimely death. Then, when Fry's video recordable birthday card hits an older Leela in the back of the head, it clears the entire thing up, revealing the harsh truth.
My whole life I've been mad at him, and it wasn't his fault.
In one of the most heart-wrenching moments in the entire series, we see Leela go to Tavern on the Green, where she was supposed to have dinner with Fry, and laser blast something into the ceiling. Meanwhile, trapped in the year 1 billion, Fry discovers the Tavern on the Green and sees the message that she left for him.
Dear Fry, our time together was short, but it was the best time of my life.
This is one of my favorite heartfelt moments in the entire series, and this is many people's favorite episode of Futurama. After Fry reads this message, he accepts his fate, and the trio pushes forwards to watch the death of the universe. This sequence is so incredible visually as they witness a new Big Bang, revealing an identical universe, allowing them to land back in their own time and continue their lives. The episode just has everything I want out of a Futurama episode. It's an incredible and funny sci-fi premise focused on emotional drama with heart-wrenching twists and character moments. It exemplifies all of the things that make the show special. And guess what? It earned Futurama its second ever Emmy win for Best Animated Series. But best of all, the episode came when confidence in the show was maybe starting to wane for fans. And personally, I think that Season 6A ended with a string of mostly very solid episodes. Some don't like the episode That Darn Cats because it sort of came out at the height of the old school cat meme craze, but I thought the premise was fun and stood on its own without relying on those lame old memes. A Clockwork Origin tackles the creation versus evolution debate in a surprisingly fresh way that kept me guessing. The Prisoner of Benda is absolutely standout, and writer Ken Keeler crafted an actual peer-reviewed mathematical equation to make their premise work, which is so damn cool. It's one of my favorite sci-fi premises in the entire series, and it's filled with some wildly funny moments as the characters all switch bodies over and over again. I'll never forget Washbucket and Amy's body professing their love for Scruffy. Incredibly funny stuff.
It would be sweet for a while, but in the back of our minds we'd know that I'm a man, and you're janitorial equipment.
We also got the 100th episode in this run, The Mutants Are Revolting, which is very solid and does something that I felt the show probably should have dealt with sooner, the fact that mutants are literally not allowed on the surface level of New York, which, let's be honest, is super fucked up. I'm not sure the twists and reveals about Leela's family made a huge impact, but the episode has a lot of heart, and I like that they have a big status quo shift in this milestone episode. Unfortunately, Season 6A's final episode is a real dud. Back in the original run, we got anthology episodes in the form of Anthology of Interest 1 and 2, which used the What If machine to show alternate realities for our characters. A really fun, very Futurama idea, but they abandoned that format in the Comedy Central run and opt simply for themed anthology episodes, the first of which is titled Futurama Holiday Spectacular. They do 4 anthology episodes over these 52 episodes, and unfortunately only one of them works for me. But despite this, overall I was really happy with Futurama's first 13 episode return on Comedy Central. It started a little rocky, but peaked with 2 truly excellent episodes back to back, and maintained a solid level of quality for the rest of that run. And Season 6B mostly continued that trend of consistency. The Silence of the Clams is Futurama's take on a mob mystery, which truly leads to one of my favorite moments in the show.
My name isn't Slick, it's Zoidberg. John Zoidberg!
Mobius Dick has a great sci-fi premise as the crew chases down a 4th-dimensional space whale. Law and Oracle does a pretty fun Minority Report parody, and Benderama tackles the Grey Goo sci-fi concept through a nanobot storyline. They even dive into Zoidberg and the Professor's history in a pretty fun way in Tip of the Zoidberg. Unfortunately, there are back-to-back eps that are 2 of my least favorite in the entire series, Newtopia into Yo Leela Leela. Newtopia is honestly just an incredibly tired premise that focuses so much on the man vs. women style humor that already felt dated in the original run of the series. It doesn't help that older episodes like Amazon Women in the Mood tackled this humor better either. The premise of this episode involves a clause in the Planet Express employment contracts that stipulates that all women have to pose nude if asked, which as a premise is just gross. Over the episode, all of the characters swap genders, so the idea is that the men are supposed to have learned something after they're forced to pose nude as well, but it's just such a frustrating premise to begin with, because it basically presents every male character at Planet Express as gross dudes who are down with workplace harassment. It's one of my least favorites for sure. But Yo Leela Leela is my absolute least favorite episode of Futurama, primarily because it's just really unfunny. I honestly don't think there's a single joke that I laughed at in this entire episode. Leela writes a TV show that's basically just Yo Gabba Gabba, but it turns out she's just been writing down the things that actual aliens have been doing on a random planet she discovered. It's just so profoundly unremarkable, and for Futurama, that should be really hard to do. I don't want to shit on this episode more than I need to because I love Futurama too much for that, but this one is easily the low point of the series for me. The season doesn't really get good again until the final 3 episodes of this season, but luckily they are 3 incredibly strong episodes. Cold Warriors is a pseudo-sequel to Luck of the Fryrish and Jurassic Bark, as, like those episodes, we jump between the future and flashbacks to Fry's time in the past with his family, this time focusing on his dad. I talk at length about this one in my video about the Fry family, but it's a very strong episode with a great emotional ending.
Someday, you may face adversity so preposterous I can't even conceive of them.
Fry's father was always more of a comedic presence, so it was really nice to see him get a couple great emotional beats.
Now bundle up. I don't want you getting frozen.
I also really like the premise of the future storyline where Fry develops the common cold and has to be quarantined as it hasn't existed in hundreds of years. That's fun sci-fi. Then there's Overclockwise, which was actually meant to act as the narrative series finale when they wrote it. Unsure if they'd be renewed for another run of episodes. And as a finale, I think it works pretty well. I go super in depth on the 4 Futurama series finale in this video here. Sorry, I'm going to say that a lot. I've talked about Futurama so much on this channel. But here are the cliff notes. Overall, this is a strong, fun episode as Bender overclocks his processor and basically becomes a god. The Professor and Cupid are prosecuted for breaking the terms of service on their bending unit, which puts Planet Express in jeopardy, leading Leela to decide to leave and start fresh somewhere else, leaving behind everything including Fry. It's a really fun and ambitious episode with great laughs and impressive emotional beats. My big complaint is that since Leela leaves, her role is super small in the episode, which I think would have been disappointing for a series finale. Though the final scene of the episode is incredibly heartwarming as Fry and Leela read the entire contents of their future together. We don't learn the details, but we do see their facial reactions, which is just a genius way to execute this idea. This leads into the one Revival Era anthology episode that I actually love, Reincarnation. This is truly an incredible episode, showcasing stories at Planet Express in 3 new animation styles. The first being old school Disney animation, not unlike the opening sequence back in The Beast with a Billion Backs. The second is video game pixel art style, and the third is an anime. All 3 of these are so incredible from an animation standpoint, but also just so cleverly written. It's really cool to see this world celebrated and explored in so many different styles. It's an all-timer and makes the fact that they abandoned the What If Machine format entirely worth it, even if I think it's the only good anthology episode out of these 4. And this was the end of the first production order for Comedy Central, and while I think it was kind of a mixed bag, it was definitely more good than bad. I would say that the bar overall may have lowered a bit, giving the general quality a little bit less consistency, but there are still some great sci-fi premises throughout, as well as a couple truly top-tier episodes. Lethal Inspection, The Late Philip J. Fry, The Prisoner of Benda, Cold Warriors, Overclockwise, and Reincarnation are honestly all so strong, with a couple being nearly perfect. Though there are obviously also some real low points, and a bit of an over-reliance on topical references and parody. This effort rewarded the crew with an additional 26-episode production order to similarly be aired over 2 years, 13 episodes at a time. But unfortunately, this last run's quality dips even further, leading to probably the weakest run of episodes in the show's history. Though it didn't start off terribly, with The Bots and the Bees and A Farewell to Arms being the first 2 episodes of Season 7A. While these aren't incredible episodes, they are very strong with a great emotional core. The first one tells a story about Bender becoming a father, which has some adorable and emotional moments. The montage of Bender and his baby doing tons of criminal activity together is super funny. The crux of the conflict here is that his son, Ben, loves bending, but wasn't born with the capability to bend. Since he only has a single memory card slot, he can't learn to either, not without completely losing all of his existing memories. Which is exactly what happens. Bender has to sacrifice his relationship with his son to allow him to follow his dreams, and it's really sweet.
Just remember, your daddy loves you. Remember that, will you, son?
A Farewell to Arms sort of plays on the whole Mayan calendar end of the world concept, which leads to a bunch of Earthlings flocking to Mars in an ancient ship to avoid calamity. When Leela isn't chosen to go, Fry gives up his own spot for her, sacrificing himself. Now, while this final sequence is silly as hell sci-fi wise, it leads to something really sweet, so I give it a pass. They discover that Mars is actually the doomed planet in the prophecy, and Mars starts hurtling towards Earth, so the crew literally jumps from the surface of one planet to the other. Unfortunately, Leela is injured and can't make it, so Fry tries to save her, and both of their arms are pulled out of their sockets, which is pretty gross, but the final shot of the episode shows Fry and Leela's arms holding hands floating through space forever, which kind of justifies all of the silliness for me. But this leads to a stretch of, in my opinion, pretty unremarkable episodes. There are some fine moments and ideas in them, but there's almost no episodes that I actually love of Futurama for something like 20 more episodes beyond this point. Now, that isn't to say there aren't things I like. Decision 2012 brings back the time code from Bender's Big Score, which was neat to see. The Thief of Baghead actually kills Calculon. Near Death Wish introduces Farnsworth's parents, which is fun. And Viva Mars Vegas gives us a pretty solid heist parody. But overall, I think Season 7A has got to be my least favorite run of the show, which unfortunately bleeds a bit into 7B as well. A few standout concepts in 7B I think save it a bit, like the dimensional drift in 2D Blacktop, and I think the episode Calculon 2.0 is pretty solid, as the crew actually resurrects the dead robot actor, only for him to discover that in death, he's a bit of a joke. It's the most emotional any story involving Calculon ever got, and I appreciate it for that.
The name Calculon used to mean something. Now it's a stain that will never wash clean. Farewell.
Towards the end, it started to feel like they were giving our main characters each a send-off episode. Assy Come Home comes to mind, where Bender has to give up his ass, which they try to play as super emotional. This sort of felt like their attempts to pay off years of the shiny metal ass catchphrase, but it felt a little bit forced to me. Leela in the Gene Stock elaborates further on Leela's mutations that start to increase as she gets older, and there are some fun moments in here, but overall it didn't feel all that remarkable. But fortunately, Futurama ends on an incredibly strong 4-episode run, starting with fan favorite Game of Tones. Now admittedly, I am not as high on Game of Tones as many. This is the final episode to explore Fry's past, like Luck of the Fryrish, Jurassic Park, and Cold Warriors before it. But they opt for a different method this time, exploring it through Fry's dreams/memories. This ultimately explores Fry's relationship with his mother in an incredibly satisfying way that really tugs at the heartstrings. And while overall I really enjoy those emotional beats, I do think the mystery of the episode, as the crew tries to discover the origin of a mysterious tone that's destroying the planet, is a pretty major letdown. It takes Fry through the events of the original pilot, which is fun to revisit, but the overall explanation for the mystery is incredibly lackluster and fails to have any real connection to what actually works about this episode, the emotional story beats with his mother. All in all though, it's hard to deny how ridiculously effective this final scene between Fry and his mother is. Fry believes he's dreaming about his mother again, but Nibbler reveals that he's actually in his mother's dream. Yeah, no real proper sci-fi explanation for it, but who cares? Fry gets one opportunity to speak with his mother again, and it would actually be a conversation that she remembers and experiences through her dreams. And rather than say anything, Fry just hugs her. It's so good. This moment transcends the episode and is easily one of the best and most emotional in the entire series, even if overall I think the rest of the episode is a tad lackluster. This is followed up by Murder on the Planet Express, which is basically Among Us the Futurama episode. A shape-shifting monster has infiltrated the Planet Express ship, and they have to deduce which person is actually the imposter. It's just a great, fun sci-fi mystery, and I'm glad we got this kind of episode in the final stretch. Then comes Stench and Stenchability, which gives Zoidberg the happy ending that none of us knew we needed. This episode is both hilarious and heartfelt, but most importantly, it gives Zoidberg an ending he deserves. One thing people do not talk enough about is the fact that Zoidberg is probably the best person in Futurama. The guy is gross and pathetic, but he's also kind and caring. I'm really glad the writers decided to give him this really charming love story as his happy ending. And then of course, the series finale, Meanwhile. And I don't think I can sing the praises of Meanwhile enough. After 3 prior attempts to write series finales, I think Ken Keeler absolutely stuck the landing on this final go-around. While the previous 3 left things off with hopeful but non-explicit endings, this one moves a little more into conclusive territory. The episode revolves around Fry and Leela being trapped together as the entire universe freezes around them. Personally, I love that the final episode of the series literally freezes everything into a snapshot of the world we've known and loved for years, as Fry and Leela grow old together. There's a montage where we see them traveling the world and growing older, and it's really the heart of the episode. Where the first finale, The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings, opted for a big musical event, the second, Into the Wild Green Yonder, gave us a big adventurous cliffhanger, and the third, Overclockwise, focused on a wild sci-fi concept. I love that this one slowed down and just let us sit with these characters one final time. No stress, no drama, just relaxed, thoughtful, and beautiful images of our favorite sci-fi couple falling deeper and deeper in love. As per usual, the episode does end with a potential out in case the show were ever to come back, as the professor rescues the couple from the time freeze and sends them back to before he invented the time button that caused the problem in the first place. But it ends with this really lovely piece of dialogue.
What do you say? Want to go around again?
I do.
Just an incredible end for the series. So how do I feel about the Comedy Central years of Futurama overall? Well, if I'm being honest, I only love a handful of these episodes, but there are also only a handful that I truly dislike, and a majority, I would say, I feel somewhat indifferent about. I do think that it's possible some of the characters suffered a bit from flanderization on this run, particularly Bender. I still think he's funny, but they end up focusing on him so much in these final 52 episodes, and it's really all centered around his belligerent attitude that became so beloved over the original run. And while I do think Bender is a funny character, I also think that in the original run, he was a bit more thoughtful. So many of his antics stemmed from a place of insecurity back then, which really allowed for us to empathize with the character. Not to say that's totally absent here, it isn't, but it was just a bit more present before. I also get a bit frustrated with some of the more topical references, both in episode premises and in individual jokes. I already ranted a bit against the iPhone episode and Yo Leela Leela, but there are also jokes and references from characters that just just feel so out of place. I know the show has always referenced back to things from our present, aka their past, but here's why I think it used to work more effectively. The original run of the show was written in the late 90s and early 2000s, which is also when Fry was frozen. So the majority of the references that Fry made in that original run were fitting for the time period in which he came from. But in the Comedy Central run, which is written about 10 years later, we've got Fry making modern references that we know for a fact he did not live through. It actually takes me out of the story when Fry repeatedly makes cheap jokes and references, like when he references the movie Tron Legacy over and over.
Before we die, I'm gonna find and destroy every remaining copy of Tron Legacy.
A film that came out in 2010, over 10 years after he got frozen. And I don't think that the show has to avoid all references to things that took place after Fry is frozen, but it should at least be somewhat believable as something that the characters would know about. If it's a cheap joke about how bad the movie Tron Legacy is, it's kind of a harder sell for me to believe that anyone would watch Tron Legacy 1,000 years later. It just feels like the show makes a few too many lazy references to whatever was in the cultural zeitgeist when the episodes were being written, whereas most of the time in the original run, the jokes and references end up feeling pretty timeless. So, was it worth it to bring Futurama back for this final run? Was the show's legacy negatively affected by the perceived dip in quality, or was everything we got just the bonus to an already successful series? Well, even though this is definitely my least favorite run of the show, I'm still infinitely grateful that it happened. I don't really want to live in a world where we never saw episodes like Lethal Inspection, The Late Philip J. Fry, The Prisoner of Benda, Cold Warriors, Overclockwise, Reincarnation, Stench and Stenchability, and of course Meanwhile. It's the finale I always wanted. While The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings is one of my favorite episodes of television, period, Meanwhile gave me the catharsis I craved that Devil's Hands didn't deliver. To me, the revival era of Futurama is inconsistent with some low lows, but also some absurdly high highs, and it delivered some absolute must-watch television. While the show may have gone down with a near-perfect reputation had it not been resurrected, I wouldn't give up the high points of these revival seasons for anything. So what else is there to say?
Wanna go around again?
You know what? I do. In 2023, Futurama's third revival in its history, the fourth era of the show began airing on Hulu, almost 10 years after the previous series finale. Meanwhile, aired on Comedy Central, and over 24 years after its original series premiere on Fox. As a lifelong Futurama fan, the fact that this was happening at all sort of broke my brain. I, alongside a lot of other fans I think, were a little hesitant to welcome the show back after it delivered such a satisfying conclusion. But on the other hand, Futurama is a show that has managed to resurrect so many times in so many different forms. We're talking DVD movies, a cable revival, a video game, a mobile game, a Simpsons crossover, a podcast episode, and now another revival on streaming. It almost feels like if any show deserves to be continually revived, it's Futurama, the little show that could. But now that we've actually seen the first 10 episodes of the Hulu era, it begs the question, should the show have been revived all these years later? Were the episodes delivered good enough to warrant negating such a strong and powerful ending? I think it's a complicated question, and obviously I've got a lot of thoughts on the new season. This video is two things. One, it's a compilation of all of the videos I released over this season, covering all 10 episodes from the new season in depth. But this time they're streamlined without sponsors, plugs, or outros. If you've seen them all already, I'm sorry, but I thought having them in one place made sense. And two, the end of the video will be me working through my feelings on the season as a whole, how I feel about the show being revived again, and what I'm anticipating for next year's run of 10 episodes. So, enjoy nearly 2 hours of me breaking down Futurama's first season on Hulu. Folks, it's actually here. Nearly 10 years after the previous series finale, Futurama has returned with a brand new episode titled The Impossible Stream. After starting its life on Fox, moving direct to DVD for a few movies, and then landing on cable at Comedy Central, this new season of Futurama is dropping on Hulu to likely live out the rest of its days on streaming, or Disney Plus outside the US. But how was the latest revival's premiere? Did it live up to the hype? Did it fall into some of the same pitfalls that the previous era did? Well, there's a ton to dig into and go over, so let's get into it. Welcome back
to the world of tomorrow!
subscribe. Okay, so there is obviously so much to talk about with this premiere, but right off the bat, I want to say that after being very apprehensive about the show returning, I'm very happy with this premiere. Not only did I find it very funny, but the ways it followed up the previous finale, as well as other Futurama storylines, were incredibly satisfying. I do think people might find the Fulu storyline a little too on the nose. It does feel like they really laid it on thick with the revival jokes, but after 10 years, I personally don't mind it, especially because I just found those jokes to be funny. But let's start getting into the details because I have so much I want to talk about, and spoilers ahead, obviously. First up, the show has new title cards when it starts now, beginning with Hulu Presents, a Hulu original, a 20th century television animation production, which makes sense. Even shows that transition to being streaming originals tend to be branded that way. But I actually like the mystery vibes and score behind these new title cards. And the episode begins directly following up the events of Meanwhile, which was a major requirement for me. This also makes sense. They directly addressed the end of Into the Wild Green Yonder in the first Comedy Central episode, Rebirth, but Meanwhile's ending left a little bit more room for them to ignore it if they wanted to. This episode opens on the world still being frozen from the events of the previous finale, with the professor explaining the events from his point of view at the end of that last episode.
Professor's lab notes. Final entry. Time has been frozen for an unknown length of time.
We see the events of the finale as we remember them with the now iconic "wanna go around again" line, and those events then transition into the present with our first of many winks to the revival effort.
Did someone switch the universe off and on?
It feels like we got rebooted.
This is pretty classic for Futurama. They referenced their first cancellation in Bender's Big Score, and the second in Rebirth with their opening sequences, though this episode definitely makes a lot more jokes about it throughout the episode than either of those last ones. But Futurama also kind of invented revivals, so I give it a pass. But let's talk about this new intro sequence. They've actually made changes. For one, the Hulu Rama logo that we saw from the trailers that transitions to Futurama is actually in the titles for this run, which will probably be weird for people watching on Disney Plus, but oh well. And our first title caption is "Avenged" in bloody red letters, a direct follow-up to the caption from the previous finale, which said "Avenge Us" in the same font. For the intro sequence differences, there are actually a few changes. The first is a totally blink and you'll miss it thing. As we zoom into New York, you can now see the Vampire State Building on the right side, which made its one and only appearance in the previous series finale, Meanwhile, with Fry jumping off of it. In this first little location, you can now see the Nimbus flying in the background on the top left of the screen. As we fly to the next location, we can now see the Momco building in the background, a major skyline change. This is actually kind of an interesting one. We first see Mom's skyscraper in a fishful of dollars, with a similar but slightly different design to this building, labeled Mom's Friendly Robot Company. They seemed to use this design in the Fox era and then transition to this newer design in the Comedy Central run. This is pretty inconsequential, but the characters flying through the tubes have changed as well, Kif being a notable addition, and you can also see 3 Omicronian ships flying overhead just before it transitions again. In the final transition, we can now see Bender dangling from the Planet Express ship, presumably singing, a reference to the second episode of the entire series, The Series Has Landed. And the last visual change I've noticed is that in the final shot with the giant screen, you can now see the Robot Arms apartments on the left side, of course where Fry and Bender have lived for almost the entire series. But the most important thing is that the full title sequence has returned. During the Comedy Central era, they almost always cut the title sequence short, including removing the old cartoon clips from the screen at the end. But to me, the biggest sin was always removing this final music cue from the theme song. The episode properly starts by actually addressing the 10-year time jump, but explaining it away with the massive disruption in time from Meanwhile, which I think was a smart move. It would have felt weird if the crew had just been on adventures for the past 10 years that we had never seen, but it also gives them an excuse to comedically explain away their canonical ages having any importance.
Did we get older? Younger? Science holds no answers.
But I love how this transition and the revelation that they're now in the year 3023 leads to the episode premise. And Fry basically has an existential crisis about how long he's been in the future, deciding to set a goal for himself. I also love that the episode is about Leela choosing to support Fry's goal, no matter how stupid it is. It's nice that they're pretty firmly making Fry and Leela's relationship a priority, even in this mostly unrelated plot. Some good reassurance to the audience that they'll handle them well in the revival. Also, let's take a look at this shot of Fry when he sets his initial goal soul to watch every TV show ever, this is the funniest off-model pose I've ever seen, and I kind of love it. I'm not gonna list them all, but the quick scroll down the list of future TV shows has some very funny little details in there. There are literally 66 TV show titles on the list, and you should definitely pause and read them all. Some of my favorites are Mets vs. Godzilla, Disenchantment, the first ever Futurama reference to Groening's newest show, Disenchantment, Alien vs. Predator vs. Bluey, Back to the Present, too many to name really. There's really funny stuff in there. But man, possibly my biggest laugh in the entire episode is the latest Scary Door, or the Scary Mirror, as they acknowledge the rise of Black Mirror as our modern Twilight Zone equivalent.
What was once a creepy story about a book is now about an e-reader that's too greasy to hold.
Fry ends up deciding to try and binge all my circuits, and they sort of use it as a stand-in for Futurama itself in their meta commentary here.
Which final season? They got canceled like 3 or 4 times.
It was so great to see more clips of All My Circuits. Those have always been a highlight of the series for me, and the clips we see in this episode are so funny.
Calculon! But you weren't due back from the time travel convention until...
yesterday?
But I'm glad that they found a way to futurize the concept of Fry binging a show, fitting him into a still suit, a Dune reference, that sustains him while he binges for basically an entire year. It would have kind of been boring if it was just about Fry sitting on the couch watching All My Circuits. And they find a fun way to turn this into a future dilemma as well, with Fry's consciousness being tied to his binge, meaning if the series ends before it untangles, he will die. The solution, again, pretty on the nose, to go to Hulu and get them to start producing more episodes so that his binge doesn't stop. This is definitely the most meta they've gone with a return episode, referencing the cancellation and revival so often, but personally I don't mind it. I think for the most part the jokes are very funny, and it also ties into enough aspects of the show's history to make it a fun ride. The Hulu executives are even the same execubots we saw in Bender Should Not Be Allowed on Television, and other television related episodes, like Calculon 2.0, and they directly address a majorly important plot point from the Comedy Central era to make this actually make sense.
There's one teensy hitch. You know the star of the show, Calculon? He's dead.
I'm so glad this wasn't something they ignored, and I hope it's a sign that they won't ignore much else continuity-wise while moving through this new era. This truly just felt like it picked up exactly where the show left off. At the end of Calculon 2.0, the robot devil was just fed up with Calculon, so he's of course incredibly eager to send him back to Earth.
Oh, glorious rapture. To return to the draped proscenium once more.
Will you shut up and get into the resurrection cannon?
I also love that we get a Dan Castellaneta cameo here for the Robot Devil. Such a great character. Glad they got him in the premiere. And we also get the return of Slurms Mackenzie, though he does not seem to be doing well. And I think they escalate things pretty effectively here. Fry starts watching at 2x speed, which means that they have to basically just make new All My Circuits episodes perpetually to keep him alive, which completely burns out the writers, and so they replace them all with Bender. Okay, I also loved how this room of writers are just character models for a ton of the current Futurama writers. This guy on the left is clearly designed after Patrick Verone. You've got Eric Horsted's head right here. This head on the floor is one of the new writers, Shireen Najafi, who I have actually worked with in the past. She's great and very funny. Over here we've got 2 other new writers, Cody Ziegler, and lastly Ariel Ladenson, who hilariously is actually wearing the same outfit as in her Instagram profile picture. I had to look her up to figure out who this was, but I love that attention to detail, and I think it's just fun to acknowledge the real world writers room of Futurama here. So All My Circuits ends up getting canceled because they were making it too fast with a robot writer, and I really liked the way that they tried to ease Fry out of his binge by transitioning the show into a synced up live performance. It's a cool concept. Unfortunately, it goes terribly wrong. They end up destroying Fry's binge chair, with everyone believing that Fry is dead.
He's dead! I killed him by encouraging his hopes and dreams. How could I have been so stupid?
Obviously, Fry didn't die, and this was immediately revealed, but it is nice to just see them double down on Leela's love for Fry with her devastation at the thought of losing him. Again, it continues to encourage me that they'll handle their relationship properly in this run. There's also a little tag where Fry talks to a panel at the White House that includes Nixon, where they talk about the dangers of streaming TV, and it seems like they're really just trying to reassure the audience that this revival was made with care.
Don't reboot a show if the quality isn't gonna be there.
Which is, again, on the nose, but personally I think the episode delivers, even when some of the episodes in the previous run of the series perhaps didn't deliver on that quality. I really can't tell you how nervous I was about this show coming back, but honestly, the first time watching this premiere episode, I almost felt giddy. They did so much that I hoped they would. They directly followed up Meanwhile in a way that both fit the storyline and addressed the time jump between seasons. They didn't ignore status quo shifts like Fry and Leela's relationship or Calculon's death, and most importantly, it was funny. I think the one episode we have that can be directly compared to this one is Rebirth. Rebirth, the very first episode of the Comedy Central era. Both followed up episodes that were meant to be finales. Rebirth used a little bit more of a metaphorical storyline with the characters literally being reborn, while the Impossible Stream did a bit more of a meta storyline with the All My Circuits reboot. But personally, I like the Impossible Stream a lot more than Rebirth and Execution, and honestly, more than a lot of episodes in the Comedy Central era. In my opinion, this is a much stronger start, especially after a 10-year gap. There are some stories that I absolutely love from the 52 Comedy Central era episodes, but they had some very frustrating writing tendencies. The show has always had serialized elements, but it felt like they were very intent on maintaining the status quo in its episodic nature, especially when it came to things like character relationships. And in doing so, it made some of my favorite characters do super unlikable things that would have been fine earlier in the show, but come across as heartless so deep into this run. The way Amy treats Kif in episodes like Proposition Infinity come to mind. One thing that was interesting about the meta dialogue in this episode was this line.
How about picking up All My Circuits for 20 episodes?
With an option for 20 more!
Maybe a movie.
And I think this definitely gives us insight into the possibilities of what we'll see from Futurama moving forward. We've already got that 20 episode pickup. It sounds like there's a major possibility for another 20 on the back end of this order, something I fully expect to happen. But the possibility of a movie is what really excites me. Look, I know it's very unlikely that we'll get a theatrically released Futurama movie, but that is still my dream. Not a movie that's actually 4 episodes smashed together like the DVD movies, but a big, properly structured, ambitious Futurama movie. We'll see. A man can dream, right? Cue Man Can Dream clip.
A man can dream.
It's week 2 of the return of Futurama, and this time they're directly following up a 20-year-old episode from the Fox era of the show, Kif Gets Knocked Up a Notch. A bold move for only the second produced episode in 10 years. This is a story that people have been wanting to see play out for a very long time, but did it live up to the hype and anticipation? I have a lot of thoughts. Let's dive into Futurama's latest, Children of a Lesser Bog.
Who wants treacle?
Subscribe. One thing I wanted to point out right off the bat is that these Hulu title cards at the beginning seem to have different music cues. Another small detail that will seemingly be changed for every single episode alongside the title captions and cartoon clips. The episode starts off a little randomly with Fry and Bender creating a honey-based chew candy to replace the residue that Zoidberg sucked off of Fry's jacket. Weird. Lots of honey and sugar going in there.
And just a touch of treacle to remind me of my dear departed Aunt Juanita. She drowned in treacle.
Did any of y'all know what treacle was? I had to look it up. Kinda curious if I'm the only one out of the loop on this one. After the honey clumps make Amy lose a couple of teeth, she opens her calendar to schedule a dentist appointment, noticing a new event reminder, which kicks off the remaining plot. Honestly, this felt like a flimsy way to connect this opening sequence with the main plot line, but you know what? That's okay. The joke events on Amy's calendar are pretty funny. Frozen yoga, hair extension cut, bacon-wrapped date night, good stuff. But the event reminder is about Kif and Amy's children, following up Kif Gets Knocked Up a Notch, which fittingly aired 20 years ago.
In 20 years, they'll sprout legs and crawl back onto land as children.
I'll be ready then.
I really enjoyed seeing Amy and Kif look back on the events of that episode fondly, and it's a nice use of the classic footage here. Also, did you notice that they're all using iPhones in this episode? I don't think they've used these iPhones since the episode Attack of the Killer App, when they were introduced, which is obviously a much hated episode, but personally, I think that the iPhone aspect is probably the best part of that episode. It had a lot of other really bad topical aspects, and I kind of love to see them use iPhones as the modern technology here. It's a cool piece of continuity that I'm surprised they didn't do in the Comedy Central era. Back to Amy and Kif. I didn't love how they caught the audience back up to speed with the Kif being pregnant storyline narratively. It felt really weird to me that they go into exposition mode to tell the other main characters about the birth of their tadpoles from Kif Gets Knocked Up a Notch. And then as soon as they show them the footage of that episode, we can see that all of them are right there in the footage. They saw it take place firsthand. I understand that they want to remind the audience of those events. It just feels off to me that the characters don't remember it, and I think they probably could have delivered this exposition differently. But these small qualms are overshadowed by sweet Kif and Amy moments.
Well, Amy, are you ready now?
Having a family with you is the only thing I want in the whole world.
This is the dynamic I want to see from Kif and Amy's relationship after all of these years. And with the Comedy Central run treating them pretty poorly in episodes like Proposition Infinity and the Butter Junk Effect, it's great to see them just lean fully into Kif and Amy as a successful relationship that's moving on to its next big stage. This episode also features the return of the Grand Midwife on Amphibios 9, who I guess has only appeared in 3 episodes. I thought she had been in more, but I forgot that she has like 3 titles from The Beast with a Billion Backs: Grand Priestess, Grand Lunch Lady, and Grand Funeral Director.
I work 5 jobs, all grand.
I guess I was just thinking about all of these jobs and expecting that she had more appearances. The one thing that I did find a little strange about the birth ceremony is that Kif's parents weren't there. They've only made 2 appearances on the show, but all on Amphibios 9 and typically for major events in Kif's life. Not a huge deal, but their lack of presence was felt, especially with Amy's parents being there. And as many anticipated, Amy's father Leo has been recast, now performed by Fyodor Chin instead of Billy West. Fyodor Chin is mainly known for his role as Zenyatta in Overwatch. I'm not an Overwatch player, but people seem to like him in that role. He doesn't sound exactly like Billy West's version of Leo, but I do like his performance here.
We wouldn't miss the birth of our grandbabies for $1 million.
'Cause we're so rich, that's like a penny.
I gotta say, the winnowing part of the ceremony was really brutal, especially because in the original episode, they fought so hard to allow the tadpoles to even make it to the water, so for most of them to just get eaten on their way out of the swamp by various monsters was a bit shocking. At least there was some nice attention to detail here, with some of the creatures being the same ones that they defended the tadpoles from in Kif Gets Knocked Up a Notch, and I totally understand why they knocked off a bunch of the kids. It would have been a logistical nightmare to try and give Kif and Amy 100 kids. Narrowing it down to 3 gives them a complete family unit that they can very reasonably use in the show when they want to, and they've got cute and fitting names: Newt, Mandy, and Axel. I also really enjoyed how they explained the differences in size for all 3 kids, with them growing at different rates because they all developed in different depths and temperatures of swamp water. In classic Futurama fashion, it's a creative way to use science to give Kif and Amy kids at different stages of development, and I appreciate that they dove pretty firmly into the fact that Leela is the kid's biological mother, especially with Newt having only one eye, which was something teased in the last shot of Kif Gets Knocked Up a Notch.
Can I help you?
Though I do have more qualms with their exposition dumping again here. Very similar to the problem I had at the top of the episode. They opt to have Leela just not even remember that she was their biological mother, even re-explaining the reproduction cycle of amphibiosians. I don't know. I know it was 20 years earlier, but this feels like a major thing to happen in someone's life. And to me, having Leela just not remember it feels out of character. It does her characterization a disservice in favor of easier exposition, and I think there are other ways they could have re-explained that aspect of the story for the audience. Maybe give Leela a heart-to-heart with Fry about her own nerves surrounding the situation, knowing the tadpoles are biologically hers. In fact, Fry seems like exactly the person who would forget those details, giving an easy opportunity to re-explain them to the audience. Oh well. Luckily, what they do with Leela the rest of the episode really works for me, but we'll get there. They do a pretty great job montaging Kif and Amy's first steps into parenthood, showing that they're both enjoying this new chapter of their lives, but are also incredibly exhausted by it, which becomes a real problem when Kif is called away by Zap on a dupe mission, leaving Amy to parent the 3 kids herself. Since Amy is so exhausted, Leela ends up babysitting the kids, and they all really love Leela. These sequences are really cute, and I love seeing Leela help Amy out and take up this responsibility, but I especially love the personal dilemma it pushes onto Amy. This moment where Amy wakes up from her nap and becomes disheartened seeing how much her kids love playing with Leela might be one of my favorites in the entire series for Amy. I just really love how they used Leela's biological connection to these kids to tell a deeply personal story for Amy. It's such a smart way to build on that storyline from 20 years ago and move these characters forward in meaningful ways. And though we see Amy lose it on Leela because she feels threatened, it leads to this really lovely moment between the 2 of them.
I'm just proud I helped you become a mom.
Kif and Zap's mission has some stuff in it I really like comedically as well, particularly meeting this bear biologist who is actually the former whale biologist first introduced in 300 Big Boys.
I used to be a whale biologist, but I hate whales.
I also enjoyed seeing Kif rescue Zap from these tardigrades, mostly so that he could get home to help Amy. It's just nice to see Kif's meek nature fall to the wayside when he needs to help his family. But the big end of the episode dilemma involves the Grand Midwife, and I really like where it goes. I just think that maybe the way they got there is a bit clunky. Basically, we see the Grand Midwife taking notes on Kif and Amy the entire episode, which feels a bit weird to me since she traveled to Earth for this and we've only ever seen her on Amphibios 9 before, but I guess I can buy that this is part of her job. And when she sees the connection between Leela and the kids, combined with the fact that she is their biological mom, it triggers a ceremony to determine if Amy is fit to be their mother or whether or not it should be Leela. I do think it's pretty weird that Leela potentially has no say in this, but it's clear that they're trying to make the stakes high so that the ending hits harder. And admittedly, the ending is very effective. I love this moment before they go into the ceremony.
But whatever happens, you're going to be okay.
You are too. And of course, the big emotional climax of the ceremony itself. As it turns out, they only ask one question. Do you or do you not love those children?
More than I knew I could love anything.
Which is all that truly matters.
These moments hit, and I love that Futurama knew to try and come back strong with a good emotional episode early in their latest revival run. I do just have questions about the road to these good emotional moments. This resolution makes me wonder why the Grand Midwife even went through with this ceremony at all. It was basically just traumatizing to Amy. This episode has some great character development and some truly moving emotional moments. I just think the way it gets to them was oftentimes clumsy. The expositional sequences, I felt, could have been handled better, and the narrative surrounding the ceremony felt a bit sweaty. Kif even has this really nice emotional moment where the execution just kind of confused me. They make it seem like Kif has to shoot his way through a family of tardigrades, but then literally less than a minute later, they flash back to show that he didn't actually shoot them. He basically used the annoying bear biologist as bait to get away from them. It was just such a quick flashback. It felt like they should have just shown the scene in its entirety in the first place. Honestly, while it might not hit quite as hard, the episode that comes to mind for me is actually Game of Tones. I know some people might crucify me for this, but to me, that's an episode that has a bit of a clumsy narrative, but it's filled with absolutely top-notch emotional moments that I really wouldn't trade for anything. Children of a Lesser Bog has some questionable storytelling choices and is a bit light on the comedy, but all of that is completely overshadowed by incredible emotional beats from Amy, Leela, Kif, and the children. Honestly, probably the best emotional moments we've ever gotten from Amy. It's hard to be upset with an episode that gives you this.
You are their mother, and always will be.
Or this moment.
You're my favorite mommy.
This one hits especially effectively because Newt was calling Leela mommy the entire episode. This is just really, really great stuff. Overall, I think the good really outweighs the bad in this episode. Like I said, I have some issues with how the story plays out, but the way this moves Kif and Amy forward into an entirely new place in their relationship is really exciting to me. They are now a full-fledged family and will be for the future of the series. A great status quo shift that won't overtly change the show, but will bring us rich new narratives for Amy and Kif as characters. And I'm really excited to see how they utilize Newt, Mandy, and Axel moving forward. For the people who were worried that the show would be too meta or topical because of the first episode, this episode wasn't either of those things. Just a good old-fashioned character-based Futurama follow-up.
Strong stuff, huh?
It's week 3 of Futurama's return. The third episode of Futurama's latest revival season is called How the West Was 10100001, which is an excellent title, might I add. And it features some of that dreaded topicality, or dreaded to some Futurama fans. But the episode dives headfirst into not only some topical subject matter, but a full-on Old West themed storyline. And there is tons to go over.
Old West. Got it.
Okay, so this was an episode that people seemed to be concerned about after the trailers because of its focus on cryptocurrency, and I do understand why people are fearful of topical storylines, but outside of a couple things, I actually think this is kind of the perfect example of how Futurama should be handling topical subject matter. They take a modern concept like cryptocurrency, but rather than just do commentary on the concept, you build out a fun-themed storyline and really lean into it. In this case, Futurama opts to liken the crypto rush to the 1800s California gold rush. Then they take this a step further and give us a fully Old West themed episode of Futurama.
Old West. Got it.
Sure, there are a few on-the-nose crypto jokes / commentary, but overall, they used it as a means to build out an interesting world and storyline that are really only tangentially related. That being said, there are definitely some aspects I wish had been handled a tad differently. Since this takes place in 3023, I kind of wish they had opted to use fictional cryptocurrencies rather than just actual ones like Bitcoin and Ethereum.
The price of Bitcoin.
What?
The virtual money is soaring once again, leading to a high-tech gold rush.
Those specificities are the kinds of things that can make an episode feel a bit dated to me. We understand the concept of cryptocurrency, and I think it would have been pretty easy to just make up some future versions. But luckily, this is all sort of a small part of the episode, as it dives headfirst into the Old West theme pretty quickly.
Old West. Got it.
And for the parts that do revolve around crypto, the Futurama writers lean into the most scientific aspects of it as a focus, with the crew attempting to mine the element thallium for the crypto mining chips. But the Old West stuff is fun, and I have to give them credit for something that made me roll my eyes in the marketing, but I've since realized is actually really clever, naming the town Doge City, a mashup of the Doge crypto coin and Dodge City, the famous Old West town. There are some fun explanations for why everything ends up being so low tech like the Old West. The professor explains that the mines are using so much power that the atmosphere is being ionized, with a cool animated visual to boot. Because of this, they can't fly the ship and have to drive.
Well, every watt of electricity goes to the Bitcoin mining computers. For everyone else, it's practically like living in the Old West.
So while they're all in Doge City, they have to find different roles in the low-tech town. Leela ends up working at the tavern/brothel. Zoidberg just steals the doctor's office after the other doctor was killed by Roberto. Speaking of Roberto, I really love how they westernize him in this one. The gun that shoots knives in particular is so funny.
Out here in the West, I need something shootier, like this gun knife I invented stole.
In general, it's pretty fun to see the characters in cowboy cosplay, but there are also some pretty great original designs. I'm kind of obsessed with this piano-playing robot. This feels like such a classic Futurama design to me. They also bring back the Borax Kid, who obviously fits in perfectly here, but the Borax Kid is such an interesting case in Futurama. He's just about the only recurring character who was introduced in the Comedy Central era, first introduced in Newtopia, with subsequent appearances in Zap Dingbat and Assy Come Home. And their focus on his gambling and cheating has been consistent in all of his appearances. This was his very first mention.
Thanks to you, I lost my bet with the Borax Kid.
Then in Zap Dingbat, we see him winning a big pot with a hand in poker at the Most Def Cantina, and in Assy Come Home, he's using Bender's arms to also cheat at poker. Though strangely, at the end of Newtopia, the Borax Kid is drawn at a pretty significantly larger scale than he is in later appearances. He's kind of just towering over the other characters here, but then after this, he's basically human-sized. Though with some great attention to detail, at the end of Newtopia, the Borax Kid proclaims that he has to leave because the Feldspar Queen is taking off, and then when we see him in Assy Comes Home, he's gambling on a space riverboat casino called the Feldspar Queen. But it's weird that there were so few recurring characters introduced in the Comedy Central era, and it makes me wonder if we're going to get any new ones in the Hulu era. But this episode utilizes all we know about the Borax Kid pretty effectively. He's seen to be an active card cheat, once again playing poker, but this time in the Old West Tavern. By the end of the episode, Fry calls him out for plagiarizing this series of young adult novels from Buffalo Blue Cobalt. The Borax Kid generally seems to be dishonestly making a quick buck. This episode also features a nice little Dwight and Hermes subplot, which I really like to see, especially because Dwight has gotten exactly zero focus since maybe Bender's Game. He makes brief appearances in Comedy Central era episodes, but nothing substantial at all. This is probably the most Dwight-focused subplot we've gotten since the Fox era's 300 Big Boys. In another nice example of the writers paying attention to continuity, we see Hermes really panic and protect Dwight when he sees Roberto.
Who's that? A psychotic killer, that's who? Get down!
Hermes has very specific first-hand experience with Roberto in the $6 Million Mon, after Roberto's mugging inspires Hermes to start replacing parts of his body with robot parts. And that shared history with Roberto, I think, makes Dwight's betrayal all the more painful for Hermes in this episode, and it's pretty funny that Dwight shows adoration for Roberto. There were parts of the subplot I really liked, like when Roberto tries to use Dwight to rob a bank stagecoach, but it just ends up running him over. I think giving Dwight a little bit of an angsty teen stage works well here, and he knows exactly how to cut Hermes deep with his love of Roberto and rebuke of Limbo.
Limbo stupid? Where did I go wrong?
Probably when you took up Limbo. From what I'm hearing, it's stupid.
And the big final sequence where Dwight limbos under gunfire to save his dad really worked for me. I feel like we haven't gotten enough Hermes and Dwight father-son moments overall in the series.
I love you, Pops. And Limbo is not entirely stupid.
I will say, Dwight does seem to be another voice that is suffering a bit from the aging of the voice actors. He was played by Bumper Robinson in the first two appearances, but he's been voiced by Phil Lamar ever since, and you can definitely hear Phil's age a bit this time, but it is more noticeable in some places than it is in others. I think Bender's subplot might be the one that didn't do all that much for me here. I actually kind of like the idea of him bonding with an animal, in this case a donkey, but they didn't do all that much with it. I was not a huge fan of the song and musical sequence that they had together here, here, though I do like the way they animated the donkey singing along with Bender. I feel like Futurama wrote some banger songs early on, but have not managed to recapture the magic of stuff like the Bureaucrat song from How Hermes Requisitioned His Groove Back. I've seen some people critical again of Leela's characterization here, but I actually don't think I agree. I definitely had issues with how she was handled in parts of last week's episode, but I think people aren't really taking the context of this story into account here. People have issues with her being flirtatious with the Borax Kid, but I saw this as the characters embracing their Old West roles, with Leela working at the tavern/brothel. And obviously it was all meant to help really put an emphasis on this final moment between Fry and Leela. I think this episode has some pretty strong jokes as well. We got very brief but strong moments from the Robot Mafia, who are Farnsworth's loan brokers.
We're also leg brokers.
I enjoyed Fry just having absolutely zero clue what a brothel is.
A brothel?
A soup kitchen?
Roberto playing the knife game where you stab around your fingers, but with his knife gun, got a good chuckle out of me. But man, my biggest laugh might have been the return of Farnsworth's short-lived catchphrase.
I'd take a shift myself, but I am already in my pajamas.
This catchphrase was used only twice in the first and second episodes of the entire show, at which point it was abandoned for some reason. This is the first time it has resurfaced in over 24 years, and I personally always loved this catchphrase, so its long-awaited return is super welcomed for me. I hope they fully bring it back and embrace it, and I really enjoyed the final stretch of the episode, especially conceptually. The big twist is that the tavern's back room isn't really a brothel, it's a server room filled with kidnapped, disembodied robot heads that are being used to mine Bitcoin.
That's actually a pretty reasonable use case for robot heads.
I think this is a pretty cool way to mash up Futurama lore with real-life aspects of crypto culture, but I think executionally, the highlight of the episode has gotta be the big final shootout sequence. Basically a six-way duel in the middle of Doge City. The Borax Kid vs. Fry, who's mad at the BK for plagiarizing his books. Bender taking on Delilah, who stole his head to mine crypto. And this old dude versus the piano robot, who just wants him to shut up. But the way they move the camera around this sequence as everyone tries to take each other out is really cool. Probably the coolest piece of animation so far this season, and it utilizes some really nice looking 3D character models. Usually these really stand out, kind of like a sore thumb, but I think they look pretty dang good here. It's a fun, action-packed climax, and it caps off a solid episode. Overall, I'm once again mostly happy with how this one came together. I think a lot of people feared that a crypto episode could have been a disaster, but they took this one in such a different direction that really gave it its own identity outside of that topicality. The Old West theming is really fun visually, but it especially sounded great with some incredible music composition from Christopher Ting. The Hermes and Dwight storyline had a nice cap that worked well for me, and this is probably the most I've ever enjoyed the Borax Kid as a character. That being said, the episode didn't blow me away or anything either. I think I'd probably call it my least favorite of the three released so far, but I also still think it's generally stronger than the earliest Comedy Central era stuff. It feels to me like the Hulu era is developing a bit of its own identity, similar to how the other eras of the show feel pretty distinct, and I kinda think that's a good thing. Expecting a show to feel exactly like it did when it was being made 10 or 20 years ago is not realistic. As times change and writers get older and rotate, series are born and reborn, they'll just go through different phases. And so far, this has been an interesting one. I think there are maybe some regrowing pains in a few ways, and they still have yet to release an episode that has truly blown me away the way the late Philip J. Fry did in the first Comedy Central run, but I'm still more encouraged than discouraged about this newest era of the series. It feels like there's just a lot of potential for this run to really grow into itself and deliver some new classics, but I guess we'll see.
Old West. Got it.
We are 4 episodes deep into the latest Futurama era, and this week's episode is both a follow-up to an absolute classic episode and its first ever Dune parody.
It is pronounced Dune.
But did Parasites Regained live up to its predecessor, Parasites Lost? Is even a Dune parody too dense for your average viewer? Did I like it? Find out all this and more on this week's Futurama Breakdown. Subscribe. So honestly, the first time I watched this episode, I was not super high on it. Certainly not as high as the characters tripping on spice, particularly because Parasites Lost is one of my all-time favorites, and there was a high degree of anticipation to see how they'd follow it up. But on rewatch, I've grown to appreciate the route they went with a follow-up to such a beloved episode. Even with the inclusion of the worms from the previous story, this one is more of a spiritual successor than it is a narrative follow-up, as both episodes focus heavily on how Leela's relationship with someone she cares about changes as that person is affected by these worms. Honestly, I have grown to appreciate how Nibbler still primarily acts like a pet, even though he's revealed his hyper-intelligent nature to the entire crew so many times at this point. I guess he just likes going out on walks, and technically murdering park patrons. I know this joke is sort of specifically about that dynamic I just mentioned, but I don't love how they specifically point out that the crew always forgets.
Nibbler, you can talk!
You always forget I can talk.
Nibbler, you can talk!
One, I just don't think the repeating joke is that funny, but two, this entire episode's premise is built around Leela's bond with Nibbler and how Nibbler's intelligence is a key component to their friendship. So I think introducing the idea that Leela actually forgets about this aspect of Nibbler is kind of counterintuitive to that conflict. That being said, I do really like how they showcase their bond in this episode, with Leela wanting to see an artsy alien film, something Fry and Bender are not interested in. Even more fun, it's seemingly a sequel to Quizblorg, first mentioned back in the Fox era.
I've heard good things about Quizblorg.
Guck, I hate subtitles.
So this whole concept is actually a very fitting follow-up to a little throwaway joke, the kind of attention to detail I love in Futurama. Though I need someone smarter than me to explain the math joke in these titles here. The Cineplex is called N sub 0plex, and the movie is Quizblorg N sub 1. Please help me, mathematician Futurama fans. You're my only hope. Comments have since explained to me that this is actually Aleph Null, Aleph being the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, basically meaning an infinite set of natural numbers. So Aleph Null means infinite, and Aleph 1 is also infinite, but it's still actually larger than Aleph Null. Math is weird. But I do love that this is the winner of the Palme d'Or knob. Film nerd jokes are way more my speed. Did anyone else translate the alienese when they were watching the movie here? The first subtitle reads laughter, which is of course when the crowd starts crying, and the second reads sorrow, right before they crack up laughing. A fun layer for the fans who over-obsess with these details like I do. I love the detail that Nibbler and Leela are having tea at the same little cafe as Fry and Leela from Parasites Lost, down to the same teacup and pot. In both episodes, it's one of the places where Leela is really recognizing her bond and connection to the other person. Though obviously in one it's post-worms and one it's pre-worms. But the way this episode really subverts its predecessor is by having the worms affect Nibbler differently, actually dumbing down his intelligence, as opposed to Fry, who became his best self with the worms' help. The first being more about Fry's own journey and determining if he could be happy with Leela, knowing that it was just the worms who improved him, and the latest being a bit more about Leela's struggle, losing the nature of one of her friendships because of the worms. I did enjoy some of the ways Nibbler showcased his newfound stupidity.
Make it American, in individual plastic-wrapped slices.
Though, in one of them I actually really hated the joke.
Alas, my mind has already degenerated to the point where I can no longer predict the ending of an M. Night Shyamalan movie. One,
this is a pretty hacky joke for 2023, and two, whether or not you love or hate Shyamalan, his problem is not that his endings are predictable. Alright, I got a lot of comments here about how the joke here is that Nibbler was so smart that predicting the ending of an M. Night movie was actually easy for him, even though it's not for us, and that tracks. The Shyamalan twist of this video is that I am stupid. But the bulk of this episode comes down to Leela, Fry, Bender, and Zoidberg shrinking down and entering Nibbler's litter box to confront the worms that continue to reinfect him. They go with an actual shrinking ray this time, whereas in Parasites Lost, everyone had tiny robot surrogate bodies that they inhabited for their Fantastic Voyage parody. I think they changed this up for two reasons. One, so there would be a bit more danger and stakes with the characters in the litter box, and two, so that the characters could actually feel the effects of the litter box Dune Spice. There are a couple pretty neat drug trip sequences in here that I enjoyed, with some pretty cool animation, though I have to admit I maybe expected a bit more from them after seeing how amazing the drug trip sequences have been in Disenchantment. I do also appreciate that they had something to parody here, obviously being Dune, though I feel like maybe they were a bit overt in how they wrote it in, whereas previously the Fantastic Voyage parody in Parasites Lost felt more like homage. And apparently this guide beetle Bilgar was played by Kyle MacLachlan.
The worms are attracted to the rhythmic pattern of Doom Beetle footsteps. Whatever you do, do not walk like a Doom Beetle.
But honestly, he sounds so much like Frank Welker to me. I would be shocked if this was actually Kyle MacLachlan. Maybe he's actually this beetle?
Dude, I feel like I'm spinning.
Kyle MacLachlan making an appearance in a Dune parody would be perfect given his role as Paul in the 1984 film adaptation directed by David Lynch, but honestly, I cannot figure out who he played. He allegedly played a beetle, I cannot figure out which one he is. Okay, I actually realized that Kyle is playing this guy.
Could he be the Quiznos Cadillac?
My bad. And this is the second time this season a relatively big-name guest star is tough to spot in the episode. Cara Delevingne apparently played the makeup robot in the premiere, and her only line was screaming as the Execubots crushed her. Super weird. But after traversing the desert, the gang comes face to face with the worms from Parasites Lost.
I know you. You're those worms that used to live in my tum-tum. Only it made me smarter.
I'll take your word for it.
And I did think the way that they all unwound from the giant dune-like sandworm into their former designs was pretty cool. And there were some super creative kills in the big battle too. I loved the way Bender attached his super soaker to his arm and sprayed them all down like a sprinkler system. I mean, Bender has to be at least 40% sprinkler system. I am curious if people are complaining about the use of ivermectin in the storyline, given its topicality during the pandemic, which personally I would find very stupid because ivermectin is literally a dewormer. It's being used properly here. But the initial resolution kinda worked for me, even though all of it is a little bit gross, as Nibbler accepts his fate in this sort of circle of life sequence, showcasing how all of the beings that inhabit the litter box form an ecosystem. And I really dug the animation in the sequence too, even though, again, all those creatures are super gross.
Even if it means sacrificing all that I am and becoming a mindless house pet.
So, I gotta say, I really thought they were gonna go through with this change. Given the relative infrequency with which they use Nibbler's intelligence these days, it made sense to me to revert him to full-time house pet, and I think it would have really helped hit home the emotional ending. But I also don't blame them for maintaining the status quo here. Nibbler and the crew accepting his fate was touching, and Leela shrinking back down for one last-ditch effort to save him parallels Fry's final sequence in Parasites Lost. And I really appreciated the final resolution, as Leela tries to determine why the parasites made Fry smarter, but Nibbler dumber.
You worms have been weakened by sub-parasites.
These parasites were actually teased earlier in the episode, and diving deep into the parasitic ecosystem felt like the proper amount of Futurama scientific specificity to make for a satisfying conclusion. I enjoyed this little joke too, after Leela spends time in the Dune Spice Chamber.
Did your senses get scrambled?
Nah. It's fine.
There are a few solid jokes that felt like classic Futurama in this one. I loved this 1-2 punch about Bender's familial lineage.
My grandfather was a pounder. Hey, I guess that makes me a quarter pounder.
And I loved the return of this classic Hermes runner with a very little twist.
My manwich!
I also appreciated seeing Bender embrace tap dancing once again, first to summon the sandworm and then again to smash the sub-parasites. A nice little connection to Stench and Stenchability from the end of the Comedy Central run. Overall, I feel similarly about this episode as I do about the previous few. They're solid. I have very few major complaints, but also it isn't doing anything that's blowing my mind either. I appreciated that this was more so a spiritual successor to Parasites Lost than it was a full-on sequel, focusing on a separate relationship at the heart of the worm dilemma. It felt like they did a good job structuring this like the original without overtly relying on references to it. It hit pretty good with some of the emotional moments between Leela and Nibbler, and had a pretty fun scientific conclusion with the parasitic web of life, not to mention cool trippy animation. But I am definitely still waiting for Futurama to really blow me away in this new era. When the Comedy Central episodes hit, I felt similarly until Lethal Inspection and of course the late Philip J. Fry dropped, which are two episodes I truly adore. I do think that the first 4 episodes in this Hulu run are generally stronger than the first 4 in the Comedy Central run, but they are still just maintaining a mostly solid quality level. Nothing that's really elevating the series. Which I guess begs the question, would you rather have an era of episodes with major ups and downs, where some are so bad they frustrate you, but some are so good they blow your mind? Or an era of episodes that are all just good? Nothing amazing, nothing awful. Just good. I'm really grappling with this idea now that we're in our 4th era of Futurama, but we're also so early in the run, a banger could drop any week, or maybe even next year that will make it all feel super worth it.
Really? Because I'm seeing poop.
Open your minds and see as I see.
Episode 5 of Futurama's latest revival on Hulu just released, and it had some major developments in character relationships that I expect made a lot of fans happy. The latest episode, titled Related to Items You Viewed, makes major strides in Fry and Leela's relationship, gives us a classic Bender insecurity storyline, and lampoons Amazon with its motherly corporate overlord. But did I like it? Did you like it? Stay tuned! Subscribe! You know, I was actually pretty surprised to see that the response to this episode seems to be the most positive of the season, season. There's a lot I like about this episode, but on first viewing, I cannot say that's what I expected the reaction to be. But obviously, this one made some big moves, namely moving Leela in with Fry and Bender, which sadly puts an end to Fry and Bender's ongoing cabbage fights.
Welcome to your new home.
Our new home.
I did speculate about this development after the trailers, so it was nice to be vindicated there. These are the kinds of status quo shifts that I'm really happy to see in this newest era. They're meaningful for the characters, but aren't necessarily going to change up the formula too drastically. I mean, the number of times we've been at Leela's apartment in the series is probably under 10, even though we did see it last week. But we even saw Leela crashing at Fry's place in the Comedy Central run in episodes like Free Will Hunting. It's just nice that this latest era of Futurama, they aren't even playing around with the will they won't they stuff anymore. Fry and Leela are a couple, they live together now, that's that. And they use this status quo shift to dive into probably our most classically Bender story so far this season, which I love to see. Bender ends up incredibly jealous.
Fry and me, we had everything. Cabbage fights, everything.
Bender's insecurities are just classic Futurama subject matter, and this is a perfect inciting incident to set off one of Bender's fits of jealousy. A good comparison is Jurassic Bark, where he gets wildly jealous when Fry starts preparing to bring Seymour back from fast fossilization, or The Beast with a Billion Backs when Fry moves to Yivo's universe. So yeah, this felt like the perfect combination of stories. A Fry and Leela development that's a long time coming, leading into a complete Bender drama queen storyline. I particularly love how at this point everybody is just kind of over Bender's drama. He's absolutely sobbing at the Planet Express roundtable, and exactly 0 people care about it.
You want to know why I'm crying? I'll tell you why.
Here we go.
The other major aspect of this episode is that once again Mom is running Planet Express out of business, but now in 3023 they've had MomCourt evolve into the future equivalent of Amazon. I mean, it's pretty clear, it's called Momazon, though it's definitely a bit of a departure from the writer's feelings on Amazon in the early 2000s.
I'm gonna take this and buy 5 shares of Amazon.com.
A risk taker. That's my boy.
Obviously, Amazon has blown up to outrageous levels since that episode was written. I think the name Momazon is maybe a tad too on the nose. We probably could have just used MomCorp or Mom's Friendly Robot Company, and the parallels to Amazon still would have been clear, but this development and evolution for the company makes a lot of sense. They've always been seen as the giant corporate counterpart to Planet Express.
Here's the big enchilada.
Mom's Friendly Delivery Company.
Previously, they were just seen as being on an entirely separate level to Planet Express. The only one who considered going toe-to-toe with them was that guy in Future Stock. Hermes kind of summed it up perfectly here.
We can't compete with Mom. Her company is big and evil. Ours is small and neutral.
But one thing we've seen in the 20 years since that episode was written is how large Amazon has become, and the ruthless tactics they use that ultimately drive smaller companies out of business, undercutting prices because their profits are so large elsewhere that they can afford to do it. And that's exactly what we see Mom doing in this story.
We're being driven out of business by Momazon. We can't compete with their free deliveries.
This episode also heavily features the moon, which is the location of Momazon's warehouse, and so we get glimpses of most of our known moon inhabitants. It's funny, I hadn't really thought about how there's still so little on the moon in the future. Pretty much just Luna Park, as seen in the series, has landed, and later meanwhile, this moon farmer's farm, seen in a few different episodes, and this town settlement called Aldrin's Gulch, obviously named after Buzz Aldrin. It was first seen in The Silence of the Clamps and revisited for the first time here in this latest episode. The town looks just about the same in this one, with a couple of changes to the building's signs. Classically, they were super attentive to detail here. Pretty much all of the moonfolk protesting Momazon at the town hall meeting could be seen as background characters back in Silence of the Clamps. Plus, we get nearly every moon character that's ever had a speaking role, including the farmer and his 3 robot daughters, the Luna Park mascot Craterface, and Sheriff Furley, who was first introduced in Silence of the Clamps. Mom ends up interrupting the ruckus to try and bribe the moonfolk into accepting the Momazon warehouse, and this entire scenario feels very reminiscent of Mom's first ever appearance, when she interrupted the auction to try and outbid Fry for the anchovies back in A Fistful of Dollars. All this is to say, I appreciate that when they utilize previous characters and locations, they make sure they maintain that attention to detail. I don't know how many fans remember someone like Sheriff Furley, but here he is, back at Aldrin's Gulch, as he should be. He's their sheriff. I also have to say, of these first 5 episodes, this one looks the best for sure. It feels like the animators were really getting their feet back under them, with characters occasionally looking a little bit off model, but this one seems to have mostly found their footing. Plus, it has some incredibly detailed sequences, particularly the Mamazon warehouse. This thing is so dynamic, so many characters, and the widest shots have tons of 3D models for robots and drones that blend in seamlessly. And with so many robots enjoying each other's company, this ties into the ongoing Fry-Leela Bender conflict, as Bender decides to quit Planet Express and join Mamazon.
There's thousands of robots to hang out with. And if a couple hundred get girlfriends, leaving me alone and devastated, so what?
It really does feel like this episode has pretty much locked in with all its characters, where the first few of the season maybe had some missteps. Bender's jealousy pushing him to betray his friends in a cool warehouse with a ton of other robots? Spot on. But I think my favorite thing about this episode is the time we get to spend with Fry and Leela. Once they get home, they start buying stuff from Mamazon, and we're treated to a fun redecorating montage, kind of reminiscent of Fry and Bender and I Roommate. But man, does it feel good to just spend a chunk of this episode with Fry and Leela doing coupley things. It really has felt like their relationship dynamic has needed to evolve. We got a little taste of the pair of them trying to go on dates and being foiled in Fry and Leela's big fling, but there's no reason why we shouldn't get new types of conflicts that stem from Fry and Leela's relationship, not from the wishy-washy nature of it. And that is pretty much what we see here. They both end up ordering so much conflicting home decor, and that causes them to bicker, and it's played out perfectly in my opinion.
This is just the standard moving in together fight.
Well, I'm glad I get to fight it with you.
I love this. They don't even really have the characters question if they made the wrong call or consider moving into separate places again. It's just a little speed bump in the relationship, and it gives me a lot of confidence in how they'll treat Fry and Leela's relationship moving forward. As far as the remainder of the episode goes, I really enjoyed the sci-fi dilemma. Basically, the Mamazon warehouse is made of self-replicating nanoparticles, so it keeps growing bigger and bigger, forcing Mom and the Planet Express crew to team up. I love a rivalry turned reluctant team up. However, I am losing my mind that Farnsworth and Igner are standing right next to each other for a lot of this episode, and we still haven't even gotten a single acknowledgement that they're father and son since it was revealed in Bender's game. Like, can we get anything? What was the point in that reveal if it was never going to be of any consequence ever again? God, Bender's game frustrates the hell out of me. I personally loved the resolution to this episode too, and they set it up so well. They failed to get into the warehouse because Mom's Invasa AI had locked even her out of it, but the self-replicating particles of the warehouse basically expand beyond the ship and the characters, placing them into the warehouse so that they can then save Bender. And though this made it very clear to me what the ultimate resolution would be, I still loved the execution. Basically, everyone is prepared to die since the sun has been blotted out by the warehouse, when the warehouse ends up expanding beyond the sun.
If these smells are correct, it will soon contain the entire known universe.
Not only did I love this resolution on a sci-fi level, but on a commentary level too. Amazon is fucking everywhere, man. You cannot escape it. Also, this was like the fourth time that Fry and Leela have said goodbye to each other around this part of the Planet Express building. Farewell to Arms and Overclockwise come to mind. Also, damn, Farnsworth was the standout character comedically in this episode.
The amazing Meccano Man in trouble? To the ship!
I kinda love that even though all of the characters, Farnsworth in particular, were exhausted by Bender's whining, they drop everything to help him. Love a found family trope, baby. And how about this spin on a classic Farnsworth line?
Sweet vampire Moses!
Honestly, I like this variation better than them just repeating the Sweet Zombie Jesus line. Love to see it. So after initially watching this episode, I felt relatively middling about it, but the more I think about it, the more I think they're really finding their groove here. The characters all felt spot on, they moved the relationship dynamics forward in a meaningful way, and built conflict around that shift. I expect some people still might find Mamazon to be too topical, even though I would argue that that's not what topicality means, but they used that storyline in a way that fully fits the evolution of the series, especially the relationship between Planet Express and Mom Corp.
Just pretend I'm not even here. Whoa!
There's a holiday for everyone.
And that holiday is Xmas.
It is Xmas in August. We are 6 episodes deep into Futurama's first Hulu season, and they just gave us the first real canonical Xmas episode since literally 2001. Wild. And honestly, this is my favorite episode of the season, easily, delivering not only a great holiday-themed story, but a super fun time travel caper. I have almost no issues with this episode and so much to rave about, so let's just dive right in and talk about I Know What You Did Next Xmas.
Subscribe.
In the history of Futurama, we've really only ever gotten about 4 XMAS related stories. In the Fox era, we had 2 classic XMAS episodes, XMAS Story and A Tale of Two Santas, and those two honestly remain just about the only 2 real canonical XMAS themed episodes in the entire show's history. We of course also got some XMAS themed segments in the first DVD movie, Bender's Big Score, but it's hard to consider that story to be XMAS themed, despite making it into the narrative a little bit. In the Comedy Central era, we only got a single holiday episode, and it was one of the anthology episodes, the Futurama Holiday Spectacular, all of which is entirely non-canonical. So even though this released in August, it's pretty cool to finally get another real Xmas themed episode after 22 years, and damn did they deliver. As any Xmas story should start, the crew is making preparations to defend from Robot Santa's Xmas assault.
Santa's not getting past that, no way! Unless he knocks it down or something.
This episode honestly features some of my favorite ever Bender acting from John DiMaggio. I swear every other line is just absolutely perfect delivery.
I know what you did next Xmas. Okay, random.
But this episode does something pretty cool. It actually shows us the origin of Robot Santa. Sort of. We had previously heard his origins when he was first introduced back in XMAS Story, but this time we get to see the events in a Rankin and Bass style animated XMAS special, and they did such a great job naturally reintroducing this exposition to the audience. I complained a bit about how they handled exposition in Children of a Lesser Bog, and it feels like this one really figured out exactly how to fit this reacquainting of the Robot Santa origin into the narrative in a way that makes sense. Since this is Amy and Kif's kids' first XMAS, they all sit down to watch the special and they learn the history of Robot Santa. They took one of the newest developments from the Hulu season and used it seamlessly to reintroduce the audience to Robot Santa. Just really smart storytelling. Plus, there's a really fun subversion, since kids usually get upset when they learn Santa isn't real. This time, they're horrified because of how violent Santa is.
I'm sorry, kids. I never wanted you to know Santa was real.
And this short Robot Santa TV special leads us perfectly into the bigger narrative. The professor has decided that he's going to go back in time when Robot Santa was first constructed and rotate his naughty nice sensor so that he isn't evil anymore. He even modified the time machine from the late Philip J. Fry so that it can now go backwards in time, which does make sense given the dilemma they faced in the late Philip J. Fry. But man, I do kind of love that every time this time machine shows up, they make fun of Fry and his time travel antics.
That way you can't accidentally change history or do something disgusting like sleep with your own grandmother.
I wouldn't want to do that again.
Right on cue, the professor outright shames Fry in this newest episode.
But I'll go alone to minimize the chance of anyone becoming their own grandfather.
These things happen.
No, they don't.
And it's funny to see some acknowledgement of this from Leela now that they're firmly a couple. Definitely one of the things she has to look past when dating Fry. The time traveling sequence is a ton of fun, just like it was back in the late Philip J. Fry, as the professor starts to move backwards from 3023, which, sidebar, is a slight retcon, since in the Impossible stream, Fry supposedly binged into 3024, at least according to the calendar in that episode. I guess they just kind of ignored that. But as soon as he starts moving backwards, we see the events of previous Futurama episodes. First, just earlier in this very episode as the gang is planking the windows, then we actually see the very end of last week's episode related to items you viewed as the crew all gathers around the smelloscope. After that, it jumps many years further. We see a quick glimpse of the day the Earth stood stupid when Fry was trying to re-educate everyone who had been made stupid by the brain spawn. Then we get a very quick glimpse of Fry's head on Amy's body from Put Your Head on My Shoulders, all before the professor lands in the year 2801. Though I will say, as fun as these are, they kind of made a little mistake by keeping these Xmas decorations on in the background. None of those should have been up during the events of any of the episodes they showed, but that's alright. Small detail. I did really like the short sequence in 2801. We see that the Planet Express building used to be a meat market, and I love the design of these old-timey hover cars. Just funny to see cars that look like they're from the early 1900s, but with hover abilities. The kind of fun retro future that Futurama usually delivers. Here's another fun detail. When the professor uses this penny to change Santa's settings, we can see that it actually has Penny Marshall's face on it, and the Lincoln Memorial on the back is actually the Laverne Memorial. Penny Marshall played Laverne on Laverne and Shirley. Alright, time for some more time travel minutia. When Farnsworth tries to go forward to 3023, he accidentally starts flying backwards in time and decides to go around. Another reference to how time is cyclical, as revealed in the resolution of the late Philip J. Fry. And we once again get a ton of details here, mostly from the episode The Late Philip J. Fry. We see the professor experience the Big Bang in reverse and then pop out in the year 1 billion, as seen at the end of TLPJF. That is not a great acronym. We get quick glimpses of the year 50 million with the beautiful Beautiful Woman Society, the year 10 million with the robot apocalypse, the year 5 million with the human race descendant flying Smurf dudes. For some reason, we briefly see the barren Earth again from the year 1 billion, not exactly sure why, that might be a mistake. Then we get the frozen cityscape from the year 105. For just a few frames, we see all of the different statues of liberty of different species from the year 10,000, and then the good stuff. We get a quick look at the Planet Express building, and we can see a giant Bender punch through the wall and then walk off into the distance. Obviously, we've seen Bender become giant in Anthology of Interest 1, but that was just a what-if machine scenario, not canon. However, I'm thinking that this might be alluding to a future episode. There's actually this really cool ad in Times Square in which you can see Bender getting zapped by the professor's growth ray, blowing up to giant size. This hasn't been in any episodes this season. Maybe it's just something they cooked up for the amazing Times Square ad, or maybe it's something coming this or even next season. Futurama has hinted at future stories like this before. Okay, but then, probably what lots of people are talking about, a few frames of the inside of Dreamland Castle from Matt Groening's other series, Disenchantment. We get a glimpse of Bean, Lucy, and Elfo all hanging out in this room, which is actually the very same room that held its own Futurama Easter egg back in its season 1, where we get a quick flash of Bender, Fry, and Farnsworth in this very time machine. This obviously is going to reignite the Futurama Disenchantment shared universe discourse, and I will absolutely be participating. Stay tuned for a new video tomorrow where I break down all of the evidence and possibilities here. Though this shot of Disenchantment taking place before the giant Bender, timeline-wise, doesn't really make sense, but we'll go over it tomorrow. Anyways, let's dive into the episode proper. Crazy how much there is to dissect in just the setup of this episode. Because the professor has fixed Santa, the crew now has the opportunity to actually spend Xmas with their loved ones, which is a great subplot. Did anyone else love this little moment?
Uncle Fry, I hope you'll join me and Cubert at my chalet in the Bronx.
Farnsworth has never called him Uncle Fry before. That was sweet. In fact, the entire subplot is very sweet. I truly loved seeing all of the different crew families getting together to celebrate Xmas. It was cool to see Kif and Amy's new big family all together. We haven't seen much Cubert in forever, even dating back to the Comedy Central era. He did not show up all that much. And seeing him having fun with the professor and Fry was really nice. Side note, I thought for a moment that this Yeti with the professor was supposed to be the Yeti that infected him back in the tip of the Zoidberg, but they actually have entirely different designs. Just a new Yeti gag. The whole bit about every family making their own version of turducken was really funny, but I don't think anything beats the live turducken from the sewers.
Are they hard to catch?
Oh no, they crave death.
I was also a huge fan of this little exchange between Fry and Leela's grandmother. He calls her the Rose of the Sewers, a nice little nod to her land Titanic origin from The Mutants Are Revolting. Rose being the character in the film Titanic, obviously.
Leela, if you don't marry him, I will.
And it's nice to see them explicitly tease a real marriage between Fry and Leela too. All of these family-centric subplots were really lovely, the kind of heartwarming stuff I crave in Futurama, but they also did not sacrifice the comedy. And the families all spending Xmas together sets up the true A story, which is that the only two crew members without a family, Zoidberg and Bender, end up spending the holiday together. Now, I know this one aspect is going to upset some fans, and I was bummed at first too. The episode never mentions or acknowledges Zoidberg's girlfriend, Marianne, suggesting that they may just be ignoring her outright in the revival. It's obviously possible that they could bring her back in future episodes, but the lack of any mention of her here definitely seems suspicious. I think they could have probably explained away her absence in a single line, that she's spending the holiday with her family overseas or something. She did have a British accent after all, but even if they don't bring her back, I do understand why they would go this route, even though it's a bummer to longtime fans of the show. The reality is that the only real reason Zoidberg had this development was because the show was coming to a close back in 2013. It was the penultimate episode of the Comedy Central run, and they wanted to give Zoidberg his happy ending. Zoidberg's entire shtick is being lonely and pathetic, and while I do wish they would try their best to maintain that shtick with Marianne in the picture, it totally tracks that they might want to revert him to his single status. But this is literally my only gripe with this episode, because pairing Zoidberg and Bender works brilliantly here. It's kind of crazy that across all of the previous eras of the show, we never really got a proper Zoidberg-Bender team-up episode, and even though Bender has historically been super antagonistic to Zoidberg, I'm shocked they didn't make this pairing sooner, because they actually have a lot in common. At their core, both Bender and Zoidberg want to be loved and appreciated. We've seen numerous episodes where Zoidberg seeks companionship and friendship. We've seen countless episodes where Bender gets jealous or attempts to achieve something that will leave him adored or remembered. Seeking that kind of connection is a major part part of both of their personalities. And so I loved seeing them commiserate over their lack of familial relationships, which leads them to this conclusion.
We could drunk drive the time machine to last Xmas and kidnap him. Then he won't be able to deliver presents this Xmas.
So their jealousy leads them to try and ruin everyone else's Xmas, which is very Bender. Usually through the adversity he faces, Zoidberg maintains a really sweet and positive outlook, but I actually love seeing Bender be the bad influence on him. It kind of reminds me of the two Zoidbergs wallowing in anger in the Farnsworth paradox. And this is the real highlight of the episode, in my opinion. Zoidberg and Bender not only perform a time kidnapping of Santa, they eventually end up murdering him. This is the Bender and Zoidberg have to hide a dead body episode. Just comic gold. And I did not expect that seeing Zoidberg do the Bender would give me like a heartwarming feeling, but here we are.
Do the Bender!
This entire storyline is not only hilarious, but shockingly heartfelt, with Bender and Zoidberg finding refuge in each other through their own insecurities.
You know, Zoidberg, you're only half as bad as I thought you were.
That means a lot.
And every single way they tried to dispose of Santa's corpse was super funny. And obviously throughout this process, Bender and Zoidberg's newfound relationship really starts to fall apart.
I wish we'd never become friends.
We're not friends, and we never were.
But we danced and murdered.
But they managed to escalate everything perfectly, with the entire Planet Express crew showing up to spend Xmas with Zoidberg and Bender. Not only does this create drama and suspense, with Zoidberg and Bender disposing of the body while the crew stands outside, but the fact that the crew came to see them would have been exactly what they needed to quell their insecurities about being alone on Xmas. The very insecurities that led them to kidnap Santa in the first place. Just such a tightly written script all around, truly. Especially when it comes to the perfect double twist at the end of the episode. First, Farnsworth realizes that when he went back in time to fix Santa, he actually set his sensor to naughty. He was the origin of Santa becoming evil all along.
Oh, I've made a complete fry of myself.
But then the real twist, while the crew is hiding from Santa, Zoidberg and Bender appear in the time machine, revealing that they had actually kidnapped Santa from this Xmas, not the previous Xmas.
Damn it, Bender, I'm a doctor, not a time machine guy.
God, this is just such a perfectly executed storyline, both from a sci-fi twist perspective and from a comedic perspective.
I think I speak for everyone when I say,
There were even hints early in the episode that this was happening, and even though I saw them, I totally misconstrued them as lazy animation. When Zoidberg and Bender first kidnap Santa, I noticed that on the wall you can still see all of the tiny stockings for Nibbler's worms, as well as the 3 below Amy stockings for her kids. And I realized that if they had gone back to last Xmas, those stockings shouldn't have been there since they're all new developments. But stupid me, I thought this was just them being lazy with swapping out the backgrounds and that it was a mistake. As it turns out, it was a hint all along. The episode maybe ends the tiniest bit unceremoniously, after the reveal that the I know what you did next Xmas threats were all because Santa knew Bender became friends with Zoidberg. But man, I have so little to criticize about this episode, especially with the Kwanzaa rap to close things out, along with a gorgeous in memory of Coolio end card. This very well may be Coolio's final on-screen appearance, and it really hit hard that they were able to wrap the episode up with this tribute. Rest in peace, Coolio. I had access to screeners for these first 6 episodes since a bit before the season started airing, and this was the one I've been most excited to talk about and hear people's reactions to. I've rewatched it maybe 4 or 5 times at this point, and it honestly just keeps getting stronger. Easily the standout so far this season. It feels like the show is mostly firing on all cylinders here. Incredibly strong character work with such a fun pairing, wildly funny storyline, a great twist baked into the time travel plot, and tons of tiny details for Futurama fans to obsess over. And it was honestly just great to see a real Xmas episode again. I was not a fan of the Futurama Holiday Spectacular, which wasn't even canon. It's literally been 22 years since we got one of these. I wouldn't go so far as to call this an S-tier episode or anything, but I honestly think it might hit A-tier for me. I just had so much damn fun with this thing, and the longer it lives in my head, the more I appreciate it. This was the first Futurama script from writer Ariel Ladenson, and I am wildly impressed. I cannot wait to see your next episode.
No! No! You take Amy's Venmo?
"2023 will go down in history as the year we triumphed over COVID-19.
Well, we've reached it. Possibly the most dreaded Futurama of all time, the COVID episode. I've been a Futurama fan for most of my life, and I've never seen the kind of nervous anticipation from fans that has led up to this episode. Which does make sense. Some of the worst received episodes of the Comedy Central era were very topical, and coming back after 10 years with a COVID parody sounds like the exact type of topicality that would concern fans, myself included. But was the concern warranted? Were they able to give enough of a future spin on the pandemic and lockdown to make it an enjoyable watch? Let's take a look at Futurama's latest, Rage Against the Vaccine, which, I have to admit, despite topicality concerns, that's a top-tier title. Subscribe. So obviously Futurama is no stranger to parodying modern-day events, but it does seem that the longer the show has gone on, the more on the nose they've gotten with some of their parodies. Sometimes these things end up aging fine, and sometimes they end up really dating the episode. I think the example most people look to is Attack of the Killer App in the early Comedy Central era. There are multiple things that are topical about this episode for the time, some of which aged just fine, and some are just barely even comprehensible as jokes anymore. The entire iPhone storyline in Attack of the Killer App has actually aged fine. People geeking out about new technology has proven to be a pretty timeless phenomenon. However, specific jokes like Leela's Susan Boyle just age the show horrendously, and were not even particularly funny to begin with. So where does an episode like Rage Against the Vaccine fall on this spectrum? Well, like Attack of the Killer App, it has a little of both sides. I don't particularly think the future dealing with a pandemic is something that should be off limits. That's not a concept unique to our time. In fact, episodes like Cold Warriors already flirted with this type of storyline previously. However, a lot of the jokes in this one are so specific to our experiences dealing with COVID and lockdown. It's hard to see them aging particularly well. That isn't to say it's all bad. I did get some good laughs in this episode, and they do a decent job futurizing their version of COVID and molding it around the lore and world building. But a lot of the topical bits stick out like a sore thumb. I did enjoy their take on COVID, which is dubbed Explovid and is basically a rage virus, hence the title Rage Against the Vaccine.
Symptoms include blinding, uncontrollable anger, as well as a mild cough, which I don't have. I'm fine.
I think this is a fun way to make the virus itself more comedic and, avoid focusing on all the death. And making Leela basically patient zero was fun. We've had stories previously, like in Bender's Game, about her bottled up rage, and I think Angry Leela is generally pretty funny. Plus, it led to this absolutely top tier, perfectly fitting callback.
Quarantine her in the Angry Dome!
So yeah, there is some really fun stuff in here, but again, some of the more specific commentary on lockdown life felt pretty tiresome for me. The Explovid tests were a little on the nose, or should I say in the nose. I did not love seeing those cotton swabs jammed that far, borderline body horror for me. And everyone using Gloom, the obvious Zoom parallel to try and work from home, felt like the most direct they could have been. What frustrates me about this one is that these jokes feel like they could have been in any sitcom in modern times doing lockdown humor. While I do appreciate how uniquely awful each crew member's camera angle is here, there's almost nothing future about this. It feels like they could have come up with some kind of newer future technology as a work from home fix. Holograms, surrogate robot bodies, stuff we've seen shades of before in Futurama, future work from home solutions that bring about their own future problems, not just showcasing the exact issues we faced in the 2020s dealing with Zoom. This is why I think the iPhone in Attack of the Killer App ages pretty well, because it was a future technology, it wasn't just a smartphone. Visually, I did enjoy some of the mask humor, with every single character wearing the masks differently, but again, so on the nose, or off the nose, depending on who's wearing them. Would we really expect them to still be using these type of cloth masks in 3023? There's really no available future masking technology at this point. I just think there are adjustments here that could have made the episode feel set more in the future. They maybe would have had to work a bit harder to find the comedic parallels, but I really think Futurama is the show that could have nailed those types of gags. While some of these pandemic-specific topics were a bit rough for me, there was one aspect of the episode that I unabashedly loved.
Irrational rage, spread through saliva and spit, constant angry moaning. It's all the classic symptoms of zombieism.
So yeah, I love this gag, that there is of course only one way to stop the virus from spreading and halt the pandemic.
The cure is always the same. voodoo.
Futurama, being such a fiercely scientific show and then opting to create a solution to its real-world COVID parallel using spiritual magic, is so funny to me. And though there are some character aspects to this subplot that rub me the wrong way, I do think it's generally the funniest part of the episode. And it was nice to get a bit more of La Barbara in this story.
Zombieism killed my father, then brought him back to life.
But I think if I had any structural criticism of the episode, it's that it has a lot of disparate stories and feels a bit all over the place. It wasn't necessarily that I disliked them all. I liked some more than others, but the episode feels a tad chaotic in its presentation. I loved subplots like Fry missing Leela and trying his best to cater to her while she's sick and quarantined in the Angry Dome.
You'll get sick and probably beat up.
I don't care. I can't stand being apart any longer. I'm coming in.
This was a small part of the episode, but it's just another example of how the show can create quality conflict within Fry and Leela's relationship, and not because of its previously wishy-washy nature. Also, I really laughed at the screen that they used to see into the Angry Dome is called Mad TV. That's very stupid, and I like it a lot. The story was once again very on the nose with its vaccine commentary, whether it's commentary on the multiple companies creating them, people's skepticism of the vaccines, social media reactions to them. It was pretty much all right there, which I did not love. However, I did love that they brought in Wernstrom with the rival vaccine to Farnsworth's. Pretty much a perfect way to implement their antagonism towards each other within the story. Really reminiscent of classic episodes like A Big Piece of Garbage, or even the Diamondium-Diamondillium rivalry from The Beast with a Billion Backs. It was also funny to see Dr. Banjo make his third appearance as a vaccine skepticist. Pretty much the perfect role for him. Banjo first appeared as an evolution denier in A Clockwork Origin, and made another appearance running a zoo on an ape planet in Fry and Leela's Big Fling. Dr. Banjo being more anti-science gives him a different flavor of rivalry to Farnsworth, as opposed to Wernstrom, who is also a scientist, and it was cool to see both of those rivalries play out simultaneously. I think I half appreciated how they used the Omicronians here. The whole spreading misinformation about the virus over social media felt a tad uninspired, but I did love that they were the reason for the Omicron variant of Explovid. I know that might be the kind of on-the-nose joke that I've been taking issue with, but using the Omicronians for the Omicron variant is just very funny to me. Good wordplay. But I'm sure you can see how there is just so much going on with the Explovid storyline here. I know they're trying to hit all of the pandemic beats, but it all being condensed into a single Futurama episode makes it again feel a bit chaotic. And while the Hermes subplot in the other half of the episode stayed mostly focused, it felt very fetch questy, with Hermes traveling all over New Orleans trying to find this voodoo solution, which added a bit to the chaotic feeling of the episode. But overall, the journey was probably my favorite part. I even appreciated just seeing Grand Cylindrical Station, which is such a cool idea and design. Hermes taking this kind of mass transit was really great world building for Futurama. We rarely see these aspects of Earth since our characters mostly just travel in the ship, but exploring how other people have to travel further around Earth was sort of a long time coming. I'm surprised we didn't get more of this before, and the fact that it's a tube-based train system is the exact type of retro future tech I want to see out of Futurama. It was also cool to see other areas of Earth. Futurama has such endless opportunity to travel around the entire universe that it sometimes feels like we don't actually see all that much of future Earth itself. We see a ton of New York, we've been to Los Angeles and Hollywood a couple times, they visited the Vatican in that Da Vinci episode, but I can't really think of all that many other examples. So visiting New Orleans was welcomed for me, and I really enjoyed the designs and backgrounds here, and the graveyard in particular had a design I really appreciated. New Orleans is famously below sea level, and so their cemeteries cannot actually bury bodies in the ground. It's a biohazard, so they did a cool job with these mausoleums and above ground graves. Also, did y'all notice the alienese on this one? Translates to human jerky, though it actually looks like the future New Orleans has sunk even further below sea level because these force field levees are massive, and force field levees are a pretty cool future concept. I enjoyed this. Speaking of force, did anyone else feel like Umbriel's cameo here was a tad forced? I don't know, seems like they could have found a better reason for her to appear other than just we're looking at the ocean. No, I didn't hate seeing her again. I think I mostly enjoyed the Bone Bot though. He was a cool design, and though he was just sort of a vehicle to get Hermes to the final voodoo location, the performance in particular was really fun, and how can you not love this final send-off for a character?
Bon voyage!
So here's where my personal taste prevented me from really loving the solution to this episode. This is an aspect of how Futurama uses Hermes that we've talked about a lot on my podcast. The big reveal here is that the voodoo man Hermes is looking for is of course Barbados Slim, which I like that on paper just fine. Barbados is a hilarious character and they have this big ongoing rivalry, so that's a fun reveal. And I even love the reveal that the person who is actually best at voodoo is La Barbara herself, bringing her back in for the solution. That's a great idea, but I have to say I'm getting a bit bit tired of the whole La Barbara cheating on Hermes with Barbados shtick, especially with how far they take it in this episode.
Afraid she might be too sexually attracted to you to think straight? Well, you're mostly right.
I don't know. Personally, after the Hermes, La Barbara, Barbados subplot in Bender's Big Score, it felt like these gags had run their course. And after having great Hermes family-focused stories like the $6 Million Mon, or even the quick glimpse we have of them at XMAS in last week's episode, I was disappointed that they sort of regressed their relationship back this far. I think the Barbados-La Barbara history adding drama to this episode resolution is a great idea. That's a fun way to mess with Hermes' insecurities, and there are tons of ways to make their history get in Hermes' head, but everything is just so overt that it kind of bums me out. Them both having keys to each other's houses, the non-stop flirtations in front of Hermes, I don't know, it all felt like a lot to me. I think I could have even forgiven the kissing sequence because in story, that is a funny way to test out if Hermes is still getting angry, re explovid. But I don't know. I think Barbados is a funny enough character that we don't need to throw Hermes under the bus all these years later. When La Barbara was introduced in A Flight to Remember, their relationship felt so sweet and genuine, but once they introduced Barbados Slim, the whole infidelity thing became such a major focus of their family dynamic. It's a bit of a Flanderization and it's not my favorite, but the end of the episode was still pretty funny with everyone getting voodoo shots. I particularly loved the subversion of the old adage from Hermes here.
Any sufficiently advanced magic is indistinguishable from science.
So overall, this episode definitely had a lot of the issues I anticipated from a more topical COVID episode. It maybe handled a couple things better than I thought it would with how they futurized their pandemic and lockdown commentaries, but they really could have done so much more. And while I enjoyed some of the voodoo subplot with Hermes, it also managed to make character decisions that I truly and genuinely hate, which was not what I expected to be my big issue with a COVID episode. This one is pretty easily my least favorite of the season so far. All things considered though, this one did at least have some good gags. I loved the rotating newspaper bit here.
Do it again!
And this was an absolutely classic Bender line.
Kill all humans!
Can robots even get the virus?
What virus?
Also, did anyone else notice this little disenchantment Easter egg in New Orleans? When Hermes is in the voodoo shop, you can see a trog hanging from a rope from the ceiling. I really hope we continue to see little disenchantment nods in the show, now that disenchantment itself is over. Also, don't forget to check out my latest video breaking down all of the evidence for Futurama and Disenchantment's shared universe.
That looks kinda fun. I can't wait to do it hundreds of times.
We are in the home stretch for the newest Futurama season. This week was another episode that seemed to have some fearful anticipation from fans, mostly because of the title, Zap Gets Cancelled. A recurring theme from fans this year is fear of dreaded topicality. But how did Futurama handle the cancel culture debate? Should the show itself have stayed canceled? Let's dive into Futurama's latest.
Subscribe.
So, fortunately, despite maybe a few too many modern buzzwords, Zap Gets Cancelled mostly told a solid Brannigan story that aligns with a lot of the characters' history in the show. It feels like a spiritual successor to Brannigan Begin Again, with a nice Star Trek-inspired subplot. Speaking of, it basically opens up with Zap, Kif, and the Nimbus smack dab in the middle of a classic Trek-style conflict. I also really like this now-running Stardate gag for Zap.
Captain's log. Stardate. National Donut Day.
Though I still don't think any of them beats the one in Beast with a Billionbacks.
Captain's log. Stardate. The year of the tiger.
I really hope they keep this gag going though. But obviously Futurama's writers are huge Trekkies, and while Zap has always been their Shatner and Dupe has always been their Federation, it's weird that we haven't gotten too many more direct Trek-style scenarios. I enjoyed seeing one here, with Zap taking forever to think about the absolute most obvious solution to stop a fire-based enemy, water. I wonder if these fire beings are supposed to be from the sun like the ones from the Inhuman Torch? They're really similar, though the evil one was small and blue while the Mystic Alderman had a more similar body type to this one, but they were orange. I don't know, it feels like they could have tied those together if they wanted. But there are two main focuses in this episode, and both are pretty strong through lines in the series. Zap being very incompetent in a ridiculously rewarding and privileged position, and Leela being very competent in a not particularly rewarding position. So the stories act as nice counterpoints to one another. other. Zap just has a ridiculously long list of embarrassing failures in his line of duty. Brannigan Begin Again obviously dealt with one of those directly, but since then there have been countless others. Having him reckon with his terrible behavior as a captain is a strong idea for an episode.
Captain Brannigan, Lieutenant Croker has made some serious, though somewhat amusing, allegations.
Leela has always been overqualified at Planet Express, and we even see her start to move forward with career changes in episodes like Overclockwise.
Thanks, everybody. It's a dream come true. A recurring dream that I can't wake up from.
So Zap losing his job due to his incompetence and Leela then being given a chance to replace him is a pretty great intersection of long-running aspects of the show. As far as Zap's cancellation goes, the inciting incident feels like classic Zap, truly in line with what we've seen from him since as far back as season 1.
He took a public shower and used me to scrub his armpit.
I think personally I didn't need the more modern buzzwords thrown around. Not that I object to them in general, it's just the kind of stuff that does make you really feel like you know exactly when the episode was written.
He insisted on telling me his fantasies about my wife.
That was just locker room talk.
I feel like Zap's behavior throughout the series sort of speaks for itself. Using these examples that have such specific modern real-world parallels feels a little unnecessary. Telling Kif his fantasies about Amy, yeah, that feels super like Zap, but did we need the locker room talk line? I guess that's just a personal taste thing. Gotta say I loved the Hyper Chicken finding his own client guilty. That's good stuff. Nice to get some Hyper Chicken action in this episode. Okay, I didn't actually watch it, but also apparently the Clone High reboot canceled a character with a big red C before Futurama did. Poor Abe Lincoln. But I really loved the concept of Zap's sensitivity training, that the instructor Dr. Kind puts them all on a simulated mission, acting as their abusive captain and giving them a taste of their own medicine. That's pretty creative.
This mission may be simulated, but my abuse will be very real.
Leela taking Fry and Bender with her to help pilot the Nimbus made for a really fun other half of the episode as well, and shots like this, where we see the entire crew of the Nimbus, really put Zap's gig into perspective, and the Trek-style conundrum she's put in is again such a great counter story to Zap's cancellation. Star Trek is so much about solving intergalactic socio-political issues in drastically different cultures, so it was so smart of them to make Leela's first task take place on a planet where they basically grope as a form of communication.
Captain, respect their customs. We need to win the hearts and knobs of these people.
It's just a really funny juxtaposition to the entire Zap storyline. I feel like the design of the Tactilians were maybe a little basic for my taste, but I loved the backgrounds and color palette of the planet itself. It does feel like this latest season has been lacking in new planetary locations. While we've had a few here and there, it's largely been very Earth-focused, so this was a nice change. I also appreciated that this episode actually gave us a bit more insight into Dupe itself. While it had previously been described as like the Federation in Star Trek, this episode makes it pretty clear that Dupe very heavily pursues its own self-interests. The leader suggested they're trying out more peaceful forms of diplomacy instead of war. But even so, they still press Leela to trick the Tactilians into signing over their natural resources for their own gain. Now, this aspect of the story did sort of fall by the wayside towards the end of the episode, but I think it's a pretty great conflict for Leela and pretty interesting from a world-building perspective.
Leela, sometimes we coerce people with war. Other times, we take the high road and trick them with peace.
I had always assumed that Zap was a more isolated example in the Dupe organization, that his behavior was an outlier. We'd seen him make these terrible and unethical decisions before. Love's Labor's Lost in Space describes him sacrificing countless waves of his own men until the killbots hit their limit and turn off. 300 Big Boys shows all of the treasure that he pillaged from another species. Into the Wild Green Yonder shows him dangerously sacrificing a huge number of men in a high-speed pursuit. Zap Dingbat shows him try to trick another species into declaring war on Dupe without realizing it so they can destroy them with no repercussions. But this episode sort of recontextualizes a lot of these things as just how Dupe tends to operate. It makes Zap's role in Dupe make more sense.
Our captain will gladly engage in the nobbling.
And of course, the big twist that Dr. Kind was actually grifting the sensitivity trainees, and the simulation itself was real as he pursued his own anti-Dupe vendetta. He basically threatens to destroy the natural resources of the planet with a Durian. So this at least sets up another Star Trek-style moral dilemma for Leela, even though it's sort of a separate one from what was set up earlier. She can have the Nimbus fire on Kind and stop him, but risk the Tactilians in the process.
He's surrounded by those poor, innocent pervs. They he might get hurt.
I did enjoy the whole roundabout way they got rid of Kind, promoting him to captain and having him fire on himself. The shot of the blast was really cool. But I think my biggest disappointment here is that Leela actually does save and secure the air supply resources for Dupe, even though that was definitely a super morally questionable thing to do, earning her a Medal of Valor.
It's pronounced velour.
And her refusal to risk the lives of the Tactilians also ends up getting her discharged. So she basically helped steal a bunch of natural resources for Dupe and didn't even get to keep her job. Kind of a bummer. But despite the slight misfire with the natural resources aspect of the story, it's fitting that Leela followed her gut in an attempt to help innocent people. Pretty excellent and on-point Leela characterization, and it leads to this great moment, one of my favorites of the season for sure.
I guess I just don't have what it takes to be a Dupe captain.
No, you have something better. You have what it takes to be Leela.
Love it. And getting that big smile out of her to replace her sad Employee of the Month photo, just a really nice capper to the episode. I love how they've been giving us these nice Fry and Leela moments like this within other stories and narratives. Big fan of moments like this one.
P.S. Fry looks cute.
And honestly, she's right. Leela, Fry, and Bender all look great in these Dupe uniforms. I especially love Bender's. So overall, this was a pretty solid episode. It did have a bit of on-the-nose terminology that feels like it could age poorly, but nothing too egregious. It was a pretty creative narrative that built on the characterizations of Leela and Zap really effectively, and shed a lot of light on the nature of Dupe in general. I loved the Star Trek-esque nature of the dilemma, and honestly would enjoy seeing even more blatantly Star Trek vibes from Zap or Dupe. Does Dupe only have one starship like the Nimbus? They should bring in another ship and another design. Maybe give Zap an inferiority storyline when a bigger and better ship comes on the scene.
Now who's the fat incontinent moron?
Well, we finally reached Futurama's newest anthology-style episode, a format that has historically been very hit or miss for the show, at least in my opinion. But where does The Prince and the Product land on that spectrum? Do we have another certified anthology classic, or is it a big dud? Let's dive into the latest episode. This week's episode of Johnny Two Cellos is brought to you by Cartoons That Curse, the podcast about adult animation starring Johnny Two Cellos and Toonrific Tariq. They've covered nearly the entirety of Futurama so far, and have been mostly keeping up with the newest season as well, episode by episode, so go check it out. Subscribe. Alright, I'll just be upfront. I did not care for this episode. But outside of the original Anthology of Interest episodes and Reincarnation in the Comedy Central era, I am just not a fan of Futurama's anthology-style stuff in general. I feel like a series set in the future already has so many possibilities, it almost feels a bit redundant to shift so dramatically into these direct parodies. But on top of the anthology stuff being a bit of a struggle for me, the story of the framing device really frustrated me, as I'm sure it did for a lot of other Futurama fans who have been very excited to see the show treat Fry and Leela as an established couple after all of these years. And then of course this episode has this bomb dropping in the first 2.5 minutes.
I was falling in love with the Prince of Space. We're getting married.
Now, it's clear by the end of the episode that this is all non-canon nonsense, but there's pretty much no indication that this is the case until the final shot of the entire episode. And it's also clear that this whole story is supposed to be about as flimsy as possible on a narrative level. In fact, I don't think the Prince of Space talks even one single time. The entire framing device takes up less than 6 minutes of the episode's runtime, while still telling a full quote-unquote story. It's a melodramatic, rushed narrative that makes very little sense and has no meaningful explanations on purpose.
I wasn't really in love with him. I was under a spell.
A magic spell?
No, a science spell.
So I do understand what they were trying to do here. The anthology stories are these advertisements that are sponsoring the episode of Futurama, but they take up so much time that the narrative itself is just hollow and unsatisfying. I think it's an interesting, ambitious idea. But sadly, for me, a parody of a hollow and unsatisfying narrative is still hollow and unsatisfying. Maybe made a bit more unsatisfying by the fact that I just generally don't like the anthology stories in Futurama. While it was all non-canon and meant to be silly, I just think that the audience is probably a bit tired of being jerked around with the Fry and Leela stuff, even in a non-canon story. For me, personally, it's just kind of exhausting. I felt a little exasperated by the episode, as someone who is sick of the will they won't they stuff, and also isn't a huge fan of the anthology parody style storytelling. Before I dive into the anthology stories themselves, there are some things I did appreciate about this episode, particularly visually. I think this is actually one of the best looking episodes so far this season, both in the framing device and in the anthology stories. The Windows universe in particular has so many great designs. The Planet Express building looks excellent, and all of the characters translate really well into that metallic toy style. It was cool to see stuff like Fry exiting the freezer tube recreated, but my absolute favorite is for sure the look of these mountains. These backgrounds are so great. The little seam and rivets being visible for the perfectly cone-shaped mountains, really great looking stuff. Not to mention this incredible wind-up snowflake transition. I loved that. The Round Wheels world has a lot to appreciate. The designs of the cars themselves are okay, but what I really loved was the design of the world with these Hot Wheels style tracks. I love when they travel up to space and it basically just kind of looks like a bedroom. The stars are just on construction paper that's been taped to the wall. These are really great details. Also a huge fan of the intricacies of the tracks that's connecting New York as well. The King of Space's castle is also a design I dug, and though this episode isn't canon, Leela probably sold this castle to the king when she worked in real estate, based on this gag back in Overclockwise.
How's the intergalactic real estate going?
Pretty good. I just sold a castle to the King of Space.
I like when Futurama takes a small gag like this and builds it out more later. It's very reminiscent of the "is the Space Pope reptilian" joke before ever having met him. But as far as the stories for these anthologies go, I really do struggle to stay focused on the parody storylines. All three revolve around death and reincarnation in some form or another, and while I appreciate that they all have a common theme, I'm not exactly sure why this is the theme they chose for toy advertisement parody cartoons. Windows revolves around Fry's winding unit coming to the end of its life cycle prematurely because it ran slowly while he was frozen. It was at least nice to see Bender be the one with the biggest issue with this.
At peace, you selfish jerk! You're my best friend! Promise you won't leave me!
This, at least, feels very in character for Bender, as does his ultimate sacrifice later in the episode. But the whole reincarnation metaphor later in the episode was strange. We see Bender's parts melt down and be reforged into a wind-up airplane, and I guess that kind of stuff just happens underground in the Windo world. Again, I didn't quite understand why this was the metaphor for reincarnation in the Windo story. The Round Wheels death and rebirth story, at the very least, made a little bit more sense conceptually, since chop shops are actually a thing, though it is sort of crazy to do a slasher horror story set in a universe full of cars. Like, imagine if Pixar made Cars 4 and it was about a serial killer. You've also sort of got a Ship of Theseus story going on here, with Zoidberg adding the parts of all of the other cars to his own body until he's no longer got any of his own parts left. Zoidberg not having friends is obviously a big part of his character, but I always felt like his whole thing is that he's still a great person regardless. It feels a little out of character for him to go on a murdering spree, but I guess that's why this is all non-canon. The Rubber Ducks and Eggulon story was probably the strangest one, but at least it finally explained why they sold these Futurama egg pins at Comic-Con this year. It was sort of funny to me that the framing device was throwing a huge wrench in the Fry and Leela connection, while this anthology story was simultaneously once again framing them as each other's true love, almost like the writers are just sort of teasing the audience with this entire episode. And at the very least, I liked the entire egg/duck metaphor for death and rebirth in this story a little bit more than the other ones. It's got a very cute Fry and Leela ending. But again, I just don't really understand why this was the theme for an anthology episode that was also parodying toy advertisement. I just really struggled with that the entire episode. I think this one also feels like it's paced a bit oddly as well, and that's because it sort of is. Usually for these anthology episodes, you use the framing device to set up the story, tell that story in one act, cut to commercial, and repeat. But because the entire game of this episode was that the toy advertisements were interrupting the actual Futurama story, they wanted to highlight how disruptive those toy commercials could be to the story. So the actual commercials/act breaks take place in the middle of the toy commercial narratives. That way we see them cut out of the toy commercials and back to Futurama, and then the Futurama narrative is once again abruptly interrupted by the next toy commercial. I think one of the reasons I always liked the old anthology of interest storylines is that the What If machine itself creates a layer of canon to what we're seeing. It's showing us a potential series of events that could take place if something were to happen to the characters we know and love. Everyone acts very in character in those stories because it's just these sort of alternative series of events, and therefore we still learn something about those characters. I think when the focus becomes these completely separated parodies, it doesn't really mean as much to me on a narrative level. It doesn't mean much to the characters that I care about. Even at the very least, in the What If Machine episodes, the characters watch the alternate timeline play out, and therefore they learn something about themselves. It always felt like such a clever way for the show to do anthology-style storytelling, and it's always bummed me out that they abandoned it in favor of these newer style of anthology episodes, none of which have been particularly good to me, with the one exception of Reincarnation, which is an amazing episode, in no small part due to the incredible animation. Sadly, I think I pretty firmly feel that this is my least favorite of the season, but again, the anthology stories really just haven't been my thing since the Fox era, and I think with the framing device opting to revolve around Leela leaving Fry again, I just really couldn't get behind this one in any way. But they can't all be winners, and I'm always curious to see if they can break the anthology curse each year. Hopefully next year we get something cool.
But I love you, and I can't afford to live without you.
Well, we made it, folks. The end of Futurama's first season on Hulu. Their first season in 10 entire years. And did they close out their return season with a bang? Personally, yeah, I think they did. The season finale, titled All the Way Down, delivers the one truly sci-fi focused episode of the season with an inspired look at simulation theory. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Not just for some top-notch science fiction, but for what I think is some really impressive subtext as well. So, let's wrap out our coverage of Futurama's new season and dive all the way down.
Subscribe.
Futurama's finale basically cuts right to the chase, immediately introducing a pixelated low-res version of Planet Express and revealing that the professor has created a simulation of the entire universe. Love when an episode just immediately dives into its central premise, especially because there's a lot to mine out of simulation theory here. This is the first episode penned by the show's co-creator David X. Cohen since Free Will Hunting in 2012, and honestly, this is my favorite Futurama script from Cohen since the original run. But like Free Will Hunting, it tackles incredibly existential themes, this time not only through Bender, but through the rest of the crew and the simulated versions of the crew. The title of the episode is derived from an old expression that alludes to the problem of infinite regress. The phrase stems from the concept of the world turtle, the one that holds the flat earth on its back in mythology. The question is, if the world is on a turtle, what is the turtle on? Well, it's on a larger turtle, of course, and what's under that turtle? Well, it's turtles all the way down. Hence this episode's simulation in a simulation in a simulation. The episode has a little bit in common with the Rick and Morty episode The Ricks Must Be Crazy, where Rick creates a micro-universe to power his car battery, in that it's got a universe in a universe in a universe. An existential story in itself, however, with these universes being simulated, it's definitely a bit more focused on that simulation theory in general. But it is funny, Rick and Morty started airing about 3 months after Futurama's last finale, meanwhile, and so they have basically aired their entire 61 episode run in the shadow of Futurama, attempting to tackle sci-fi stories in ways that Futurama hadn't. Now, with Futurama's return, they have to avoid covering sci-fi ideas too similarly to Rick and Morty. Honestly, this only has a few similarities to the Microverse episode, and Rick and Morty actually won an Emmy for their riff on the time button from Meanwhile, which they directly call out as being a concept from Futurama.
A device that lets you save your place like in a video game, but in real life so that you can try stuff and then go back to your save point. Yes, Morty, I saw it on Futurama.
Even though it was in simulated form, I really loved Fry and Leela's little date in Space Italy. It is pretty funny that despite last week's episode, every other story this season has made a point to highlight that Fry and Leela are a couple and that they're doing really well together.
I just can't understand how it doesn't fall down.
Let me give you a hand.
Honestly, I think what I loved most about this episode is that it really did make me think more about simulation theory. I've never really looked into it seriously before, but they did such a great job breaking it down into concepts that anyone can understand through the dialogue and character interactions. Basically, the professor explains that there are limitations of his universe simulation due to the limitations of his computer's processing abilities.
So I had to have the information travel outward gradually at a fixed speed.
Like the speed of light in our universe?
Right!
I also appreciate that the one really pressing the professor on these ideas is Amy. It feels like only a handful of episodes really embrace her scientific side, and she did get her doctorate back in the episode That Darn Cats.
So your programming shortcut is like quantum mechanics in our world?
Exactly like that!
I also think it was genius for them to further explore the simulated universe through Bender's eyes, a character who is constantly going through his own existential crises. After Amy calls him artificial intelligence, he not only goes through another one of these crises, but starts intensely relating to the simulated versions of the characters. Through his own existential baggage, he empathizes with them and tries to protect their universe at all costs.
They deserve the same respect as any other living creature.
This leads to the professor using a sewage-fueled hydroelectric dam to properly power the simulation, allowing it to continue running and increasing its resolution, which leads to the next major development, and really what the entire episode is built around. That simulation of the universe then develops its own simulation of the universe.
Sweet facsimile of Space Italy! A simulation? Within a simulation?
The progression of the simulation stories escalate pretty perfectly. We basically see them catch up to the current episode's story. There's even a little low-res sequence of the simulation playing out the events of this season's premiere before that. So the simulation catching up to this episode means that they then start to question whether or not they might be in a simulation, just like Amy did before. But now, with our crew observing the simulated crew, they know the answer to their question for certain.
I mean, what if our laws of physics are just the computer code of some big, brilliant professor playing God up there?
Nailed it.
So for the simulated characters, in order to figure out if they're living in a simulation, they decide to force the collapse of a magnetic star, something so complex that the computer won't be able to properly simulate it without glitching out, which the non-simulated professor realizes will, without question, show them that they are in a simulation. And Bender's existential empathy overload leads him to want to be the one to tell his computerized compatriots that they aren't real. He wants to be there for them in that really difficult time. The professor hooks him into the simulation, but before Bender can tell everyone, Fry's impassioned speech about what they mean to each other brings Bender peace.
It doesn't matter if I'm real?
So what did you want to tell us, Robert?
Just thank you.
So as they force the magnetar to collapse and the system overloads, Bender somehow reboots back in the real world and reveals that the professor can simply underclock the computer, leading it to run the simulation so slowly that the magnetar won't collapse for centuries, leading to the absolutely beautiful final sequence as the simulation glitches out and Fry and Leela slowly move to embrace each other. Okay, I know that was a lot of recap for the last few paragraphs, but this is all important for some major analysis here. There are two things I really want to talk about with this episode. One about the lore of the show that is subtly hinted at here, and another about the metatextual meaning behind this episode. And both are really cool in my opinion. Without flat out revealing it, this episode is heavily implying that the Futurama crew we follow also live in a simulation, and it's all hinted at through Bender. The professor tells Bender that his trip into the simulation will be a one-way trip. There's no way for him to return. And yet, without explanation, Bender returns. But he doesn't actually. What's happening when Bender reawakens is that the Bender from the next universe up is going into this simulation, just like our Bender went into that simulation. He reboots and awakens the exact same way in both instances.
Where am I? Rebooting. Where am I?
In both cases, Bender asks where he is because he's jumped into a simulation he doesn't belong to, so listen carefully to what he says when he shows back up in our universe.
Oh, I had to come tell you something.
Bender is sad and wistful, not like when we last saw him inside the simulation, where he had accepted his fate and the fact that he isn't real. Like our Bender wanted to tell the simulated crew that they weren't real, this Bender came to this simulation to tell them something as well. There's no explanation for how Bender came back or how he knew how to save the simulation. It's because he's a different Bender from the next universe or next simulation up.
It's Bender's all the way down.
This idea might make some fans mad, since now the Bender we've been following is stuck in the underclocked simulation, and now we've got a different Bender, but I think the science fiction of it all makes it worth it, much like the results of the late Philip J. Fry's universe jumping. But what I want to talk about even more than this subtle Futurama lore bomb is the metatextual takeaway from this episode, or at least my metatextual takeaway. To me, it's sort of about the show Futurama itself. The way I see it, Bender's adoration and connection to the simulation of the universe is a stand-in for us as an audience and our love for Futurama. Bender has grown this immense connection to these simulated people and cannot cope with the idea of their existence coming to an end. A concept that Futurama fans are all too familiar with. We love and adore these fictional characters because even though they aren't real, there's beauty in their stories that we connect to. And I think the dialogue throughout the episode really reflects this idea.
Would it be any less beautiful if it weren't real? And we weren't real?
They, of course, aren't real. We know this, but they still have a real impact on us.
We're nothing more than atoms, right? But somehow, we are more.
And this even extends to when we dislike an episode of the show. The fact is that we care so much about this show and these fictional characters that we truly feel disappointment if the show lets us down. These moving drawings have a real, tangible effect on us, positive and negative, and that is special. Obviously, this isn't unique to Futurama, it's fiction in general, but in a way, this show is a simulation. Obviously, it's not a literal simulation, but it is an entirely fabricated world and universe. And while this latest revival wasn't necessarily one any of us expected, in the past, Futurama has been canceled prematurely, and there have been times where we as fans were all Bender in this episode, desperate for the simulation that we connected to continue its life, hoping that it doesn't end tragically. And obviously, beyond that, there's the existential message of it all. Bender is a character in particular who is constantly searching for the meaning in his existence, which has always worked great given that he's an artificial being. But this is obviously something that humans do in general, whether that's seeking answers through religion or science or philosophy. And if the answer is actually that, oh, we are literally all just in a giant simulation, ultimately, does that matter? It doesn't change anything from our perspective, because existence isn't about the answer, it's about the meaning we find within it. The answer probably isn't going to bring you peace. The connections we make are what are important to us, whether we're real or we're simulated.
But I love you, now and forever. And that much is real, even if we're not.
The more I watch this finale, the more I really, really love it. So many of Futurama's best episodes balance mind-bending sci-fi premises with impressive existential and philosophical themes, and this one really nails both. I'm not sure if it's my #1 favorite of this newest season. It might sit just behind I Know What You Did Next XMAS, but who knows, this one keeps getting better for me, so it could overtake it. This first Hulu season of Futurama definitely had its ups and downs. Going in, I was not convinced it should happen at all, and while I do still think Meanwhile was a beautiful ending for the show, we've gotten some stuff this season that I'm really, really grateful for. And after a 10-year hiatus, I feel like the writers can really start hitting their stride in the next 10 episodes.
Either way, the laws of the universe are way beyond our control. So what can we do? We just make the best of it.
So let's talk about the season as a whole, and more importantly, that primary question. Was reviving Futurama in 2023 a mistake? If these were the only 10 episodes of the series we got in this entire revival, I probably would have said, yes, the show should have stayed dead after Meanwhile in 2013, despite a couple of truly excellent episodes and a finale that I think will just be more highly regarded over time. But if I'm being honest, with 10 more episodes on the way and possibly 20 more after that, I'm feeling much more positive about the future of the show than negative. These writers hadn't written for these characters in nearly 10 years, and some of them had never written these characters at all. And not unlike the Comedy Central era, they opted to get a handful of topical subjects out of the way in that initial run. And while I do think there are a couple of massive missteps this season, at least for my sensibilities as a fan, in general, I felt like they were doing a great job shaking off the rust and getting back into the swing of writing Futurama. It almost makes me wish they had saved episodes like Children of a Lesser Bog for the next run. That's an example of an episode that I thought was good and so close to being great. But because of some clunky exposition that led to some weird characterization, it didn't quite hit as hard as I wanted it to, despite a great ending that tugs at the heartstrings. But while the progress wasn't linear, there are some episodes I really loved this season, and the strong episodes showed that the writers are able to get a good handle on this world and characters again. I Know What You Did Next Xmas in particular was just such a joy to watch. The fact that they were able to give us an in-depth character pairing we had never really gotten before is amazing in itself, but I will never get over Zoidberg and Bender trying to dispose of Santa's dead body. It's so funny. Overall, the season had 2 episodes I really hated, underrated, 6 I thought were varying degrees of solid, albeit with different issues, and 2 that I thought were truly top tier. I know I already gushed about it, but I do think All the Way Down will just be looked at more and more fondly over time. To me, it's got that Godfellas-like quality, just a perfect balance of sci-fi and existentialism, the true sweet spot for Futurama. The reason I am more optimistic than pessimistic moving forward is because we got strong episodes like these. I Know What You Did Next, XMAS is actually from a new staff writer, Ariel Ladenson, and All the Way Down was written by the series co-creator David X. Cohen. The fact that we got the 2 best episodes of the year from some of the newest talent and the guy who has literally spent 30 years working on the show if you track it back to development is a really good sign in my opinion. Quality at both ends. I think both old and new writers in the room are really finding their groove in writing these characters again. Plus, they've gotten some of the more topical stories out of their system. This is something we saw back in the Comedy Central era as well. The first stretch of episodes had a lot of topical subjects, and those really dwindled the longer the show went on. Plus, for the next run, we're actually getting some returning writers from the Fox era. Bill Odenkirk and Kristen Gore both have scripts in the episodes that were released in 2024. Bill Odenkirk's last written episode of Futurama was the masterpiece The Farnsworth Paradox, and Kristen Gore's was the all-time Leela episode Leela's Homeworld. So personally, I don't think we can say whether or not New Futurama was a mistake quite yet. Obviously, this is my subjective opinion, but the show has always had missteps in every era. One thing I ask myself is, are there any episodes that I would just be so sad to have never seen? In the Comedy Central era, Lethal Inspection and The Late Philip J. Fry were the first episodes that really won me over despite a rocky start. This time, I Know What You Did Next, XMAS and All the Way Down, while maybe not as strong as The Late Philip J. Fry, are episodes I am so grateful to have seen. But I think that the big test in regards to this question will be the next series finale, something that Futurama has done so well historically. The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings and Meanwhile are among 2 of my favorite pieces of television, and even their lesser known series finale attempts, Into the Wild Green Yonder and Overclockwise, deliver really strong ending beats. If Futurama ends up delivering a dud of a series finale, that would probably be reason enough for me to end up feeling disappointed about the show returning at all. But I have a lot of faith in their ability to deliver finales. Next year's season finale is called Otherwise, and it has been confirmed at a panel that it's being written by Ken Keeler and written as though it could be the series finale. Even though I expect the show is likely to get renewed for an additional 20 episodes, this will be a really good indication of whether or not the show will end on another high note. Or it actually could be the next series finale if they don't renew. I guess we'll find out. As it stands, I felt the latest Futurama run was a mixed bag for sure, but the highlights were enough to keep me really excited and optimistic for the next 10 episodes. And just as the first time Futurama has been on the air since I started my career in cartoon media analysis, it's been really rewarding to break down the show with y'all week by week, so regardless of what the future holds, I'm really grateful. Honestly, I'm gonna keep dreaming big and hope this all culminates in a theatrical Futurama movie.
A man can dream, though. A man can dream.
I stay mellow watching Johnny Two Cellos. He talks cartoons, he's a really cool fellow. He keeps you posted on adult cartoons. If that's what you're into, then grab a spoon and a very big bowl of your favorite cereal. Feels like Saturday morning cartoon material. Johnny Two Cellos, watch him on YouTube. Now enjoy this groove and bust a move.